Hello, hello. This is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop Podcast. If you're here for the live premiere of this episode, let me know if you can see me and hear me in the chat box over there. You have once again got double trouble here. It is me, Justin Colletti, and Joel Wanasek, known for his involvement in many things, including Drumforge, Unstoppable Recording Machine. Are you officially involved with Joey Sturgis Tones?
I'm not, but I do have a set of plugins out through him, and Joey's my best friend, and we own like 2 other businesses together. So I guess, sure,
Unofficially
no.
involved. All right. Nail the mix. There's a whole bunch of other stuff, but in addition to being a general audio entrepreneur whose face is on the internet and who is good at doing the talking and the teaching, he is a great mixer. And I've got to say, I've mastered stuff that Joel has mixed. I've had the privilege of doing one track recently that just blew my socks off, knocked my hairpiece off my head, that kind of thing. And really impressed by his work. He's done really high level mixing for major artists in the metal genre. Bless the Fall is one of the big ones that comes up. Pop artist Miyavi is one that you've worked with a bunch, is more of a pop artist.
I just did half of Scott Stapp's new record.
Nice. Cool. So this is a guy who's in the trenches doing it, legitimately making great sounds. Really excited to have him on. Joel Wanasek, thanks so much for joining us today.
Justin, always a pleasure to be back.
All right. The big thing I want to tell you about Joel that I want to kick the conversation off with is he's like a man running into a burning building, in the sense that there's a whole bunch of people running out of a burning building called using analog gear for mixing and audio stuff. And there's a whole bunch of big names recently who've stopped using analog gear and going more and more in the box. And Joel is going the exact opposite direction. For so much of his life, you early on were on exclusively digital systems, then hybrid systems, then back to digital systems. And now you've gone and bought a console without moving faders. You're insane, but you're going to tell the people why they're insane and why you're the only sane one in a world gone mad. Now, before we do it, and you give me the whole story, Joel, the quickest thing I got to do, just shout out our sponsors. Soundtoys is sponsoring this month. Try anything they make for free over at soundtoys.com. Also sponsoring this month is Ultimate Support Stands. I'm using one of their awesome broadcast stands right now. More about those guys later. Let's get into this conversation with Joel. So Joel, what made you start to run into the burning building of mixing with analog gear and go out and buy a console that costs tens of thousands of dollars? What made this happen?
How much time you got? No.
Okay. An hour.
All right. So I'll try to keep it shorter than 55 minutes. But
yes, we'll talk about other stuff too.
Let's start with some context, because I think context is important. So anybody watching this that maybe isn't familiar, because what happens is people come in and they have a certain set of views based off their own experience in the world they live in. They usually don't get the opportunity to try out the opposite side of the thing. So it's easy if you've grown up on all digital systems, like say me or whatever. If you don't have context, so just so people know that I'm not just pulling this out of my rear end, and I may or may not know what I'm talking about here. So I started out, I've been doing this like 22 years professionally or something. I don't know. I lost count, but a while, I've been around, and half of that time has been spent mixing totally in the box. And just so we have some context, I do have a #1 song I mixed in the box. I've had plenty of charting stuff. I've mixed some of the biggest metal bands on earth during the time, like Attila and Bless the Fall and Miss May I, etc. Because I used to ghost mix all of Joey Sturgis' stuff for a very large period of years. And, so I know how to mix stuff in theory in the box. And I feel just as competent on it as any other format. So
that sounds like more than in theory to me, but go on.
Right. I feel like it's important to predicate that, because like when I do my own YouTube stuff, people will be like, oh, you must not know how to mix in the box. I'm like, I have a #1. I know how to mix in the box,
Yeah. There is that pushback that a lot of big mixers did get. I think there's some tiny bit of truth to it. I understand where people are coming from. It's like if someone's worked on a console for their entire life and now they have to make the transition to mixing in the box, that's probably harder than the other way around. Learning how to mix in the box and now going to a console is probably easier than the reverse for a lot of those people.
Yes. And we could talk about that. But before we get into the why, right, let's talk about the how, because I think there's some good stories in here. So the first part of my career started, and then the first time I heard analog, I was going to say is like 2011. And I had this band. I went over to you may know Dan Malsh, who's got the Sound Mine in Pennsylvania, and Dan's where Andy Wallace mix out of. And if you don't know who Andy Wallace is, for the love of God, Google him, because he's one of the greatest mixers to ever grace this planet with his talents. truly a living legend. And,
Mhm.
you know, I remember walking into Dan's studio as a young guy, you know, and I'm self-taught from a basement and I'm all in the box. And, you know, it was my whole world, you know? And I remember walking in and like, I'm like, Dan, how did you get that bass sound, dude? It sounds insane. Like I've never heard bass like that before. Cause he's running through an SSL 4000. And I'm looking at the chain and all I see is like a little crank on the EQ, an 1176 and the fader up. And I'm like, what else do you have on that? And he's just like, because you know my plug-in chain was almost the same thing. I'm like, why does your bass sound like 90 million times better? Like I can feel it move. And he's just like, dude, you've never mixed through an SSL before? He's like, no. So that whole trip there through gear kind of changed my thing. I went hybrid for some years. Then I started mixing a lot of Joey stuff. And then I was doing a ton of pop. So it was like no one cared and everything was in the box. And all disclosure, because I have a company that does sell plugins, there was a point in time where I was sitting down with my programmers and like, you know, I'm like, all right, digital technology is going to catch up. It's just a matter of time. Wait till we hit AI. Wait till we this and that. And all that was fine and dandy. And I was a firm believer and I got rid of all of my gear. And I was down 2 years ago into a desk with a cheap interface and a set of Amphion speakers on them and a sub. And like, that was my life, was a sit stand desk, you know, and a computer basically. And that's what I was doing all my work on. And I was fine with it. And then something happened. So,
and I have to interject just to say that there are a lot of people making great records that way who work in that format, including yourself is one of them. I mean, as much as I feel like you would say that your work has improved now and you would credit your system to part of that, it's not like you were pulling your hair out thinking you had terrible results on the system you were in at that point.
But I did acknowledge that I had plateaued for 2 years. Now, part of that was my own fault because, you know, I own businesses and anybody who's an entrepreneur is always like, oh, cool, we own some, let's go build some more. So I started like a Nutra company where I was selling health supplements and stupid stuff like that. And it did really well for a while. But it also probably turned half the hair on my head gray from stress because that's just too much. So I got out of that and I came back. I'm like, what do I want to do with my time for the rest of my life? Like, what do I really care about? You know what I mean? And I came back to mixing because that's what I love most. And that's what I want to continue doing. So I decided to, you know, after kind of like, we'll call it a loose 1.5 to 2 years off where I wasn't really actively pursuing stuff, but just kind of like, as it comes in, I'll pay my rent, but I wasn't focusing on it. I decided to jump back in like hardcore. Like I'm going back in, getting in the game and shooting for the top again. So I had started off because I haven't played guitar in a while and I like did my own fake band. And I had done this really badass in the box mix. I got in the car, I was comparing it against all the modern ITB stuff of all the ITB mixers in the genre, because I'm friends with all of them because I know from Nail the Mix. And I'm like, cool, I'm slamming. And then I pulled up my stuff and started kicking up 2000s mixes, which to me are like the absolute pinnacle. And I was just like, man, something's missing. Because like when I went to Colin Richardson, to Andy Sneap, and to like, you know, Daniel Bergstrand, and some of these A-list metal guys that I've just, the guys that I grew up like worshiping their work, I was just like, there's something missing. And it's not EQ. It's not like my drum sample or whatever is, you know, it's not like my balance is off or my compression. There's just something missing and I couldn't figure it out. So I went nuts. And then I got the idea. I'm like, oh, I used to love gear. Maybe I should get a summing mixer in here. So I got a Dangerous 2-Bus Plus. I bought it. I dropped it in. I threw the mix I was in. I made some adjustments because it will color your sound and you're supposed to mix into one of these things. People make the mistake of just smearing their stems, throwing an already finished in the box mix through it. And that's not how it works. Analog will color your sound and affect the decisions you make. So you need to mix into it and then compare, instead of what most people do is just take their finished stems, smear it with distortion and then go, oh. So I made some adjustments. Go ahead.
I want to interject here with a quick question because we're almost skipping a little step that actually happened in your life, to my understanding. You're talking now about going from digital to hybrid. But at one point, you had tried hybrid before, to my understanding. You were all digital and then went hybrid and back digital. Correct. So what stopped you from doing this before and what made you say, okay, I'm going to give it a shot again?
Well, like I said, I think I covered it because I went to Dan Malsh's and then I went hybrid for some years. And then I just got lazy about it because
so the Dan thing happened before the time you went hybrid. Gotcha. Yes. Understood. I was thinking that this is what made you try hybrid again. What made you try hybrid again is I want to get more serious. I'm listening to these old records and I'm feeling the same thing I felt when I felt was with Dan. Yeah.
I couldn't get better. And no matter what I did, no matter what I tried, and I've seen every mix technique and talked to every mixer, you know what I mean? At this point in my life, you know, I mean, nail the mixes I've watched every educational video that's ever been done by anybody legit, minus like some weird stuff on YouTube or whatever. And I just like couldn't think of anything. I couldn't find any way to get better. And I was really stressed about it. And when I got the summing mixer in, I got in my car. Oh yeah, hold on. There's a step before. I was listening to an old record that I had produced from like 2012. And while the mix with the same band a couple of years later, which was mixed more my all in the box style, that I did it like 2012 and then 2017 or 18, I did the remix. And I'm like, the remix is technically a much better mix from like every metric you can possibly think about it. But why does my 2012 mix, before I knew what the hell I was doing, hit and snap and have more impact? And there's certain depth that's missing. And like, there's this thing. And I'm like, why do my drums sound better? Why this mix isn't as good? These tones aren't anywhere near the level. So when I got the summing mixer, and I threw it in and I listened to this mix I was doing, I was like, oh my God, at first transient, I heard it. I'm like, oh, there's that thing. So then I was like, okay, let's get a bus compressor. So then I was like, okay, maybe I'm reevaluating everything in my life. So I went on like a 2.5 to 3.5 month blitz with my assistant, who's also, Joe's worked with me for over a decade. And like, we just went down the rabbit hole so hardcore, testing every possible thing that you can think of digitally, trying every plugin, every combination, doing ridiculous stuff like Jason Joshua throwing 10 NLSs or 8 NLSs on his thing, trying to mimic his console, etc. And I tested everything I could possibly find, and I could not get the same front to back, left to right, top to bottom thing that I got through my summing mixer. Now, that evolved over the next 3 months as I ended up buying an API console. And as I got a small console, I had the box 2, and started getting some more outboard. I was just like, at some point, I was getting such massive improvements in my sonic sound and getting the sound I want out of my head. I ended up buying an SSL about 4 months ago, and I'm just mixing at a completely different level now. I've been winning text mixes against, I'm not going to say names, but people who I feel like I shouldn't be able to beat in my head. And it's very encouraging for me, because I finally understand how to get the sounds from mixers that I love, that no matter what I did in a computer, I could never get. Now I can just effortlessly get on my board. And it's just like, I'll put it to you this way. When I take faders up in the DAW, right, there is an inherent softness and flatness to digital that you cannot get around mixing. And I have never heard in my entire life, and I'm really keyed into this because, like I said, I will sit there and compare records done by people in different formats, and like for hours and hours, endless. And I will sit there and I will compare. And like, if you raise the faders in digital, you can't get around the inherent cloudiness. Like, I immediately want to start EQing things. When I take that and sum that out to my board and I raise the faders, I'm like, man, everything just immediately does this. Like, I don't need to EQ as much. Things move, they push, they pull, they have a movement to them that was missing. Like the bass, I can feel the performance.
I feel like I know what you're talking about, Joel. And before I throw cold water on all of this by playing devil's advocate and asking you all the annoying questions that people are going to ask, I want to first give you some agreement, which is, it is absolutely a thing where you have to do way more tweaking, I've experienced, in digital than in an analog format. Like, you have to do work to get to the starting place of analog formats. So I worked at Joe Lambert Mastering is where I did all my mastering, I want to say from 2011 to 2016, 2017 in that studio. And we had all of the, usual suspects of super high-end analog gear to do mastering through. We had a Manley Varimu, and we had a Maselect compressor, and, a pendulum limiter, and Sontec EQ from the 70s that probably is worth like $20,000, all that stuff. And man, I've had the similar experience with high-end audio gear in studios. I remember the very first time I ever ran something through a Manley Massive Passive, and I was like, oh, I wonder what the EQ settings are on this thing. It sounds better already. And it's like totally flat. And you're like, oh, it just makes things sound better without you doing anything. There's a lot of gear that does that just has this character just from running through it. And I know exactly what you're talking about. There's this separation that happens in width. There's this front to back that happens. There's potentially there's transient smearing in a way that also seems to give things clarity and make them more intelligible, probably because we're reducing the distance from the peaks to the average. So it's both being softened and being made more clear and intelligible at the same time. So those things...
Take it a step forward on that. I think it also adds a lot more emotional connection to music. It goes beyond just like the technical stuff that we can measure. I know that's probably
the
like
using of it 100%. I mean, being on a mastering desk where I'm grabbing knobs and not looking at the screen and I'm looking between the speakers and I'm only allowed to see the images in my head, that is huge too. So in addition to what the sounds might be doing to you on an emotional level, and I think they do because I think there's some sounds that are familiar. We've heard them again and again. Like if you hear someone hit a well-tuned Ludwig Superphonic in a good room and you've never heard, or a Black Beauty, a little bit more, pertinent to your genre, hit a Black Beauty in a decent room for the first time, and you put a mic on it and you're like, I don't have to do anything. It sounds like how drums are supposed to sound, when all you've been doing is, recording really badly tuned, really badly headed drums in bad rooms. And all of a sudden you're like, it sounds like it's already been recorded. So there's a sonic aspect that does that familiarity and emotional connection, but there's also a workflow aspect. And I'm curious about bringing that workflow aspect more into digital, but I'm sorry,
Sure.
Go on.
Yeah. So here's a good story that I think illustrates my point. So I have an analogy. To me, like digital mixes kind of are the equivalent of VR porn, where analog are like, you know what I mean? Like you can make it look like it, sound
I actually
like it.
don't. I would never know what you mean on this topic at all, but go on.
You can make it look like it, sound like it, but at the end of the day, you're just effing yourself. So you know what I mean? I know that's a bit of a streaming analogy, but I think it helps people understand. So here's a story that I think is great. I had an artist I was mastering for, who's a pianist, an amazing voice. And she records herself and things like that. So she sends me this mix and I mastered it on some hardware. And I sent it back to her and she's like, wow, this is really great. I love how this sounds. She's like, don't you think it's a little too saturated? I'm like, interesting. I'm like, let me try something real quick. I want to do a fun test. So I sent her the exact same moves digitally on the plugin equivalents. And by the way, I just want to put this out. I do love plugins. Plugins, workflow are very superior to digital. Analog is a pain in the ass, but I'm not doing it for convenience. Okay. I'm doing it for sonics. So I sent her back the digital version of the master, identical. It's like the same EQ curve, the same dB boost, the same, what's different? Electricity, right? Analog distortions, which we can't accurately model. Okay, whatever. So she sits there and she listens. I'm like, I want you to close your eyes because I didn't tell her what was what. And I want you to tell me which master you like better and why. And I'm like, I want you to tell me which one. Don't think about EQ. Don't think about saturation. Turn your stupid audio brain off. I want you to tell me which song makes you connect right here to your song more on an emotional level. And she was like, okay. She's never listened to music like that before. She sat down and she hit play and she's like, the first one by far. She's like, and then she starts taking it apart. She's like, it sounds like identical EQ. She's like, I don't understand why. I'm like, let me tell you the difference. When I listened to the first one, and I can't explain why, I'm not an electrical engineer, I'm not Einstein, a physicist or whatever, but I feel like I am sitting right next to you in the piano, like while you're playing, singing your heart out. I feel like I am in the room next to you. I can feel that coming out of the speakers. It hits me. It raises the goosebumps on my arm. When I listen to the second one, and this is like just A being like click, 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 like mixing it up. You know what I mean? And when I listen to the second one, I feel like I'm listening to a recording of that. And the only difference is a tube. You know what I mean? Like, and a conversion, right? So technically that throws me off. But like when I learned to listen to things like that, just like when I heard bass coming off the bottom of my SSL, I'm like, my God, there's so much more low-end headroom in analog. I know that doesn't make sense from a technical point of view. I don't even know if I understand what I just said, but I'm telling you as a mixer, I can do things in the bottom end on my SSL that would make the computer crack in half. And it is crazy how thick, how fat, how much energy, how much movement and bounce I can get out of a bottom end on an SSL that in a million years I cannot get out of a computer no matter what I try, and I've tried everything. Yeah. And to me, when I listen to that, man, it like really, those movements, that depth, like you just can't create it in a computer. I've never heard somebody do it.
Yeah, I would say that it's tricky because sometimes there's two different brains we have, right? We have this kind of technical engineer brain and this kind of emotional mixer brain. And I can say with the technical engineer brain that the description you give of having more headroom in the low end is probably technically incorrect, in that what is happening most likely is that there is possibly some reduction in low end that is allowing you to push bass instruments further up in the mix and be kind of clear without hogging as much low end, because there's going to be probably less representation less accurate representation of the low frequencies in a way that's awesome on the SSL, that's adding this kind of clarity to the bass. But the reason maybe that's happening is that you're actually losing some low end. It is messing up your sound in a way that potentially sounds good, and is that
I mean, I'll tell you this,
appropriate,
like,
and that
when I listen to my
sounds
bottom
familiar.
end, when I listen to my bottom end in the computer and I just push the routing button out at Unity and it's the same volume, I feel like I'm gaining it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I understand. Technically, it throws me off because I don't have the technical chops to sit there and explain it. And maybe somebody who's smarter with that stuff. But I'm telling you what I hear, and I'm a mixer. When you sit down every single day of your life and you work on a rig and you hear like a difference in a converter, some people online be like, oh, they have the same specs. You can't tell, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, if you can't hear this, you shouldn't be doing audio because this is obvious. I can throw this to the intern and they'll be like, whoa, this is better, or this is worse, or listen to the mid-range change. Like, you can't hear this? And then people on the internet will argue. They'll be like, well, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, you probably shouldn't be working in audio if you don't understand those differences. So
ooh, shots fired.
Yeah, I'm just saying,
shots
like,
fired.
if you can't hear minute detail, you're not going to beat somebody like me in a mix-off unless you get lucky, you know?
Well, I'm going to, here's the place where I'm going to give pushback, not because I disagree with everything that you said, but because I'm watching the comments come in and I'm seeing the split of, people who think like, thank God someone's finally saying it. And someone who's like, oh my goodness, you're missing so much, Joel. So before I get into the specifics that I'm going to, because I don't want to directly contradict anything you've said here, I want to read some of the comments in here about this idea of workflow. And I will give a skeptical voice because there's part of me that has experienced some of the same things you're experiencing. And there's part of me that's like, I'm not going to go back to analog ever. And here's why. And I want to get that out there as well. But before I do, you actually had something that was surprisingly persuasive to me on the idea of workflow when it comes to recall. Because one of the big reasons that I've moved to digital from analog is I have done comparisons where I mastered additional songs for albums that I did at JLM on the analog system. And in 2 cases in the same week, I got an extra track from the artist. They said, we want to add this on to an LP in one case, and we want to add this on to an EP in the other case. And I, with nothing but headphones that I've literally checked every master I've ever done on, with nothing but those headphones and plugins, I tried to recreate the masters I had done and make it so that these new songs would fit with all the rest of those tracks that I did on the analog system. So I did that. It took me probably 3 or 4 hours per song, but then I created a kind of a system and created a way to kind of duplicate what I was achieving, albeit with extra steps than what I used to have to do. But the results, I sent them back to these clients and they were like, sounds great, fits into the album, works perfectly with everything else, we're good. And one of those 2 projects has gone on to, there are songs on that record that have millions upon millions of streams. And the song that I did digitally has no fewer streams than any of the other songs on the album. Well, I mean, other than like the lead singles, like it's no lower than the average. Like it's at the average or probably slightly higher than the average on that album. And like, obviously it didn't hold it back. So that's one reason I'm okay with having gone digital is I know that I can get the same results that I was getting. Maybe that's a failing in my part, that I can get it equally as good now with, albeit more effort. I have to do more things to do it. But the other reason for me was workflow. Having to deal with revisions, mastering analog is super annoying. I have to write everything down with pencil while I'm listening to the playback. I'm literally writing down every single knob in pencil. And then I have to pick up my pencil drawings and get every knob exactly the same again to do a recall. I absolutely hate it. Talking about the workflow advancements and how spiritual it is to be on analog, like, no, there's nothing spiritual about that at all. It sucks. It's annoying. Even writing the stuff down takes me out of my emotional connection with the music. I hate it. Digital, I don't have to do that. I open it up. It's like a word processor. I'm back where I started. So the biggest thing people are going to throw at you is you have a console, Joel, doesn't even have moving faders on it. You're a crazy person, but I heard your talk about how you're doing recalls with that console, and you make it sound shockingly simple. So how do you do recalls on your analog console that has no moving faders on it?
Sure. Let me start off with saying to you that I agree with you 100%. And that was the first thing I said, because I actually wasn't looking at an origin. Okay. So I ended up, for some context, I bought an SSL Origin 32. If you've ever seen that board, it's a dumb SSL. It doesn't have any recall on it. Doesn't have any moving faders. Hell, it doesn't even have dynamics. You got to go buy a 500 rack and snack them in, but you got EQ on every channel and 64, 32 longs, 32 shorts. I was at NAMM And I was going to buy an AWS because it's got all the fancy crap on it, but it's also twice the price. It's 120 grand versus say 60. And when you break it down to a loan, it's maybe you're one of the smartest finance people I actually know, Justin. And I would say that because you and I have talked hours about, investing, it's an extra $1,000 a month on your loan payment, right? Okay. Which, depending on what kind of level of work you are, that destroys your life, or it's just like, whatever, it's not a big deal. So, it depends what level you play at, the type of budgets you get. So, I was talking to TLA, and I love Tom. He's just such an enthusiastic guy. And
that's Tom Lord Algae for non-audio snobs like us. Go on.
And if you're not familiar with Tom, he's a super mixer. He's one of the biggest mixers to ever live. And Tom's like, dude, get an Origin. I have an Origin. You'll love it. He's like, quit screwing around with this and that. You don't need an AWS. Get an Origin. If you like the 4000 song, get the Origin. It's a modern 4000. I'm like, yeah, but dude, and I start throwing everything from Gearspace at him. I heard the parts are made in China and the quality's not as good. And I heard this and that. He's like, shut up and go sit down and go twist some knobs in that thing. He's like, it's badass. He's like, I have one in my Studio B. When my main one dies, that's what I'm using. I'm like, I don't believe you. How much did they pay you to say that? And he's just like, here's a picture of it on my phone, dude. I have it. This is my upstairs B room. Okay. So I sat down and I felt the knobs. I'm like, oh man, this is like higher quality stuff than my API. And I love API. That's not a slander against them. But like, I'm like, these knobs feel insane. I'm like, okay, well, I guess Gearspace is wrong again. And then I started mixing on it, and I listened to how it sounded. And they had that Green Day session open that day or whatever, and I was like, okay, this sounds like, it was crazy. So I'm like, okay, I love how it sounds. I love the price, and I love the size. Like, it looks badass. And an AWS kind of looks like a toy to me. So I'm like, Tom, how do you do with recalls? So he starts going on and on and on about how he does it. And then he's like, I want you to challenge you. He's like, I've heard enough of this. I want you to sit down and just make the assumption in your head for tonight and come back tomorrow that, how am I going to make this thing work? I have to make it work. I'm like, okay, challenge accepted. So I sat down, I thought about it all night. I came back the next day, and then I figured it out. It took a lot of thinking because I had to basically reevaluate my entire workflow. But I came up with a system that's so easy, which is hilarious because I haven't even needed to use it or recall. I don't even do recalls, but I'll explain. So on the Origin, they're actually really smart. We'll talk about automation in a second, because that's the next question they're going to ask me. I know for a fact. So the first thing on the Origin is you got 32 long faders. So what do? You mix the damn song. You know what I mean? If you want dynamics, boom, you got outboard. You buy any flavor you want. You want to change the level, grab the fader, move the fader, right? Get your mix done. You want to EQ it, you got EQ. You can throw the EQ on the small fader, the long fader, whatever. So you mix the song. You want to bring back effects, sends, boom, bring them back. I return them on my small faders.
So now, quick question. Are you performing a mix that you're then capturing and then you can recall that performance? Or are you doing some automation in the box and having it come out in faders?
Oh, a ton in the box. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Gotcha.
So there are multiple ways to do this. And the way that I do it, and again, each one is just like accepting a different workflow. I mix it on the larges, and then I have another set of converters which are calibrated differently, because again, you got to bring it back in with the stems having headroom, and now they're maybe quieter, right? Then they're going to send them out, so you might have to knock them up 5 dB or whatever. So I have it set up where I can then bring them back up on the small faders at Unity dB by pushing the 0 dB button, and then I can push one button on each fader, which is follow large fader routing. And now I have the whole mix back on my large faders after I've printed my mix into 32 stems, and it comes back at Unity and it is exactly the same mix going into these. So all I got to do is recall, which never changes, the EQ and bus compressor settings and the master fader gain level. That's it.
So long story short is that you have up to, say, 32 channels on this desk. You have direct outs on each channel, and you're recording the output of each channel back into the computer.
Correct.
So you can just set everything at Unity. And then when you play it back, you're playing back your processed mix. So you have a full recall of it. As long as all of your faders are at 0 and your EQs are off, you're hearing the mix that you recorded in channel by channel. That's so simple. That is actually not a difficult recall.
Stupidly simple. SSL is brilliant for thinking this up. But now again,
you don't even necessarily need to have a brilliant 2-channel fader system. You could still do recall a second day. You just record the direct outs of every channel on any console. And even if you don't have the second set of faders,
Yeah.
you need to come back another day. You just bring it back up with everything at Unity Gain, and you're hearing the mix that you performed and
Yeah,
recorded
and
in.
bypass all your EQs and all your junk.
Done.
So I've got mine set up where all my small faders are cleared, other than, you know, pushing a button, and my patch bay is set up a certain way where I can bring back my mix on my small faders at Unity for any mix that I've ever done any day without even having to think about the console. As long as the routing, which I always use the same routing, is the same, right? As long as the bus chain is the same, it comes back and it's 99.9999999%. The only thing I can hear is a slight AD trip, which is like, you know, if you were going to argue about that on a recall, then you've never done a recall before, because like people, you know, you'll do like that in the EQ, you know what I mean? Like there's always variance. So it's such a small tolerance. It's almost the equivalent of opening it up in your DAW another day. So it takes 30 seconds to do. Now, that being said, I've not actually used it like that, even though I've intended to use it like that. I've actually used it more like a giant summing mixer where like I'll mix a song and then maybe, you know, a lot of times I have the same stuff on the same channels, right? So my bass EQ might not need to change from thing to thing, because I might just make a small adjustment in the box or something like that, write the automation in the box going in, even if I'm doing it pre-compression, which I thought there's no way that can work.
You could be using each channel potentially like CLA uses as outboard gear, right?
Like a preset, yeah.
Like, I put it on this, I send it out to this compressor, I don't touch the compressor, and either it sounds better or it doesn't. It sounds better most of the time. So
and
you could be like,
awesome.
I'm going to send this to bass channel 1 that has this EQ on it, and maybe I sweeten it a hair more from there in the box or whatever.
I did like 24 songs I mixed, and on this thing, and I was mixing a record for a guy named Keith Wallen, who's the singer and guitar player of Breaking Benjamin. So Keith is on like BMG Rise, and, you know, that was like a 12-song record, and it took all month to do it. But I had, you know, one day I'm mixing hip hop on the side of that. The next day I'm mixing death metal. The next day after that, I'm mixing active rock, and then another pop song. And it's like, I'm bouncing around all these different genres, and I just kept the same board setting. And I'm just like, oh, well, my cymbals don't sound good on this song here on my overheads channel on my board that I've got marked, but maybe if I move them to fader 26, 27, or you know what I mean? 27, 28. Like, so I would just throw things around until I find something where like, dude, that sounds better, you know? And like, you just play. And so it didn't slow me down at all. I actually kept my board in the same recall without touching a single thing for like 10 different artists. And not one of them didn't love the mix that I sent. So
one of the big little lessons I think it could be a takeaway for anybody is that cheating in mixing is not only allowed, but encouraged. The more of it you can do, the better. I think is a good adage. But it's interesting.
This is important.
I was going to say,
like I took shortcuts or there was any artistic, like I didn't give each band their full, you know, I didn't mix them uniquely to the style. Cause like I said, that's, I'm doing different genres. You know what I mean? I don't mix a rap song like I mix a death metal song. You can't. It's a totally different approach.
Right. And when I say cheating, I'm talking about cheating in the process. Like you ideally are not cheating the end goal. The end goal is like the result is what matters. And however you get there is irrelevant, which I almost feel like clients shouldn't care about what gear you use. They should care about your end result, regardless of what you're using. Because if I gave someone a master that they loved and they really loved the idea that I was doing it on analog, and I told them I was doing it on analog and I gave it to them and they loved it and it was secretly done digitally, that would be terrible because I was lying to them. But if they love analog gear, assumed I was using analog gear to do it, loved the master, and then later found out that I was doing it digitally, should they now hate the sound of the record? To me, that's insane.
It is.
You know, so what I'm saying is that the place to cheat is in workflow. And the more you can find workflow cheats that get you to a better result, keeping you fresher and more artistically and creatively engaged with the project, the better. But one last thing about this process of recall on an analog console, you could plausibly perform it like a mix, do all these rides, ride the bass, ride the vocal, ride it section to section. And then if you get a call back from the client saying, I love it, but I really feel like we could have done a better vocal ride, you could literally re-ride the vocal again. Like you could take the already written vocal and rewrite it slightly from Unity Gain.
I mix the song and I want to run automation. I just sit there and I print it on the direct out, and then I screw it up. I just do it again. And I just like they do on an old school, they'll just mark it off with a piece of a pencil on the side of the fader and then just do their rides, and they'll print each section, and then they'll take the direct outs, bring it back at Unity, bop it back through the bus chain. Boom, the mix is done. So it's not like, is it worth $60,000 for the ability to have a computer do that for you? You know, I'd rather spend an extra 5 minutes of time and not have to deal with that and get the sound I want, which is the 4000 sound, instead of getting the fancy bells and whistles and the 9000 AWS super analog sound.
Yes. Now, I'm going to, in just a moment, do the devil's advocate thing and throw some cold water and give voice to some of the naysayers here in the comments. But before I do that, the one thing I want to bring up on this recall issue is, surprisingly to me, now that I'm thinking it through, it seems to me like it would be easier to do analog recall in the way that you're describing, more easily in mixing with 32 channels where you have direct outs than it is in mastering. Because my problem with mastering, and why I still am not convinced and why I still don't think I'm going to go back, is I don't have multiple different channel outputs. I could take a direct output from my EQ and a direct output from my compressor and a direct output from my other analog EQ and then try to recombine them all. But they're supposed to go together in a certain order. Like if the EQ is going into the compressor, that EQ is supposed to change the compressor sound. So now if I need to go back to the EQ, it all becomes the same. Like I can't just mesh them back together in parallel, because in reality with the mastering chain, it's happening in series, and I can't record those separately and put them back together in parallel and really expect to have the same result. Like it does not, I can't see how this approach could work for mastering because it's a 2-channel process. Unless I print the finished master and then from there try to tweak it. But there's certain things you can't do. I can un-EQ something, but I can't uncompress something. I can't unsaturate something. So I still don't see how this kind of simplicity of recall that you have on your system could benefit me in mastering. So it's still making me skeptical for myself.
Yeah, I mean, look, it doesn't matter what I do or what you do. I think anybody watching this, what matters is you find your thing. For me, there are certain things that earlier mixes have and certain movements and like emotional, like that newer mixes, while they're mixed technically better from like, you got to do way crazier stuff on a higher level. Like active rock. I'm going to beat up on all my friends in active rock because I mostly mix active rock and radio stuff. So
what is active rock? For those who aren't familiar with the genre term, what are some big names in the genre you'd consider active rock?
Oh God. I mean, you don't think of like anything from like Disturbed to Linkin Park to like Bring Me the Horizon to there's all these metal bands that have crossed over. Falling in Reverse, all these different bands, you know what I mean? Just turn on like the hard rock station, like in Wisconsin to be WJJO. Like, the thing is when I listen to a lot of active rock mixes, cause a lot of producers are mixing, it's all I hear is like guitar presets. They use this drum sample pack and like everything, it sounds like it's mixed good, but it doesn't hit. And I'll tell you a story that was kind of funny to me. My bass player in my fake band is a mechanic a car finance guy. And he was hanging out with a couple of mechanics and they were sitting around there like, man, why do new rock mixes just suck? I'm like, what do you mean by that? And he's telling me about this. He's like, I can't explain it, but they just don't hit back like they did in the 90s and the 2000s. Like they don't crank the same in the car. Like it gets louder, but it gets more, it doesn't move air. And I'm like, this is a guy who has zero audio training in his life. So I have so many examples of like, I'll give you an example, pop managers who've come to me and hired me to mix and be like, I've never heard a pop mix sound like this. And they'll be like, I've hired this and this and this and this and this and that guy who's done this and this and this Grammy, this and that. And he's like, they all sound the same. I'm like, yeah, because they mix on the same format and they have the same sonic signature, even though the plugins are different and the chains are different and they EQ differently. The tone of their mix is missing because it's the same tone, which is the digital. Digital doesn't sound anything. It has a sound. Everything has a sound. Tape had a sound. An SSL has a sound. A Neve has a sound. Metro Halo converters have a sound. A computer has a sound.
Yeah, you're identifying two different issues here. And the first one of those issues I could say is, and this is me playing devil's advocate, is how old are these people talking? Are they people who are in their 30s and 40s who formed their loyalty to what music and records should sound
early
like?
30s. I see that argument. Like people get used to things, but let's talk about stuff that lasts. And I'm going to play devil's advocate on that because music now, man, I'm not going to say that. It's going to get me in a lot of trouble. But what I am going to say is that a lot of music now, I'm not trying when I mix to get, my job is to get the best sonic result for the artist and make the most emotional connection for the song. It's not the convenience of my own workflow. And I get it. I have strong incentivized bias, just like any other mixer, to get paid the most amount of money and to keep the most amount of money for the least amount of my time. I'm not interested at that anymore in my life. I'm interested in the art of it. And that's what I care about the most and I'm very passionate about. So, in terms of like releasing stuff, the problem now is I feel like while there's more stuff coming out than ever and it's more democratized, like where are the great bands that came Like you go back to 2000s and you go back to the 90s and you go down the lineup, you can just, Stone Temple Pilots sounds nothing like Alice in Chains, sounds nothing like, Aerosmith, sounds nothing like Linkin Park, sounds nothing like, you know what I mean? You can just go how differentiated. Everything just sounds the same now. Music now isn't lasting. It's not having the same impact. I argue that you could say songwriting, editing, whatever, budgets, blah, blah, blah. I think the Sonics play somewhat of a role, and that a lot of music now doesn't have the same emotional impact because of the way that it's mixed.
It could
and
be.
It's not on a technical level.
Yes. There's a few factors at play here, and I think you might be touching on one of them. I have to, just because my brain goes there, I need to mention all the other factors. And one of the factors is that when we're 30 and 40 and we hear music of today and we formed our emotional loyalty to the way music sounded in the past, that's one. But that's only one of many factors. There's another factor here, which is that when we're looking back at the 90s and the 2000s, we're only listening to the bands that survived. We're not listening to the bands that didn't survive, and all of the sounded like crappy bands who were trying to be the 9th Alice in Chains and failed because there was already one Alice in Chains. And we don't hear the band that was trying to be the 17th Aerosmith and sucked, because those bands are in the dumpster bin of history. And right now, when we experience history currently, we don't get to look back at the ones that survived and the ones that were unique. We're looking into the dumpster bin and trying to pick out gems. When we look at the past, the trash has already been taken out. So all that's left is the gems. So that's another aspect. But the thing that I think is uniquely true, what you're saying, that once we talk about all these other variables, one thing that's uniquely true possibly is this idea of homogenization of music, because people are all learning from the same sources. There's a lesser degree of kind of like local scenes, local studios, unique pieces of gear. We all have the same exact tool sets cloned out a million times over. We all have access to the same exact sources of information. We all have the same mentors or lack of mentors in many cases. Our mentors 100%. Just whoever's popular on YouTube rather than personal mentors. So there isn't this distinct personality, this distinct humanity, and there's maybe a even greater degree of homogenization and copying now than in the past. Although I'm sure there's an instinct to homogeneously copy what was successful in the past. It's even more achievable today, potentially. So I think that might be something that's unique, although I'm not positive.
What's interesting, I agree with all of that, actually. And I've thought about all of this a lot. So one thing that's interesting for me is like, I mix a lot of LA stuff, right? So like an artist will go and work with the same 20 songwriter teams, and they'll send it to a producer who will then cut 12 of those songs, and they send it to a guy like me to mix it. And what's interesting to me is like, you have all of these teams trying to write a single. So it's like you get to an album and no one makes an album anymore. They got 12 different teams competing for the lead off single. And like, everything just sounds like the same song structure, the same format. The guitar tone might change slightly. The preset might be different on the Kemper, or they program the drums on this or that, I always struggle with it, because as a mixer, I'm an artistic guy. Like I can do that. Like when I was mixing for Joey, dude, we had, try not to swear. I kid you not. Joey and I were mixing 50 to 60 songs a month for years that all just wanted the exact same sound, the exact same Pod Farm guitars, Steven Slate drums, Kick 12. And they all wanted it because they were like, this is what's cool. And it was endless. So were we wrong just cleaning that up and giving them what they want? That's what they wanted. They're like, make a sound exactly like this. And then every time we would try to veer off and do something artistic, they were like, no, it doesn't sound like this. The last record you did, it needs to have the same sound as this. And you're like, you're not that band. But that's what they wanted. And we made a ton of money giving people what they wanted, even though morally, internally, that eats somebody like me up, because I don't ever want to do the same mix on a different artist ever in my entire life. I want to experiment and do different stuff and come up with a unique sound for the band and brand it sonically against everything else. And I'm super into that. But at the same time, it's just like, dude, I got 3 kids to feed. So I'd rather mix records for a living and do what I'm told and do it to the best of my ability than sit there. And so I see so much homogenization happening. It's crazy to me. And again, there's so many reasons for that. We could talk hours and hours and hours and hours about it. But
there is this weirdly conservative bent in music. And I don't mean, politically conservative. I mean like
they're afraid to break
ground. Well, but here's the reality. We are using microphones and coveting microphones that were invented 70 years ago. And not to say that they don't sound great, they do, and we can talk about all these reasons for it. But part of it is familiarity, And so much, there's this big portion in music where very few people want to stand out by sounding radically different, because they're afraid that it'll just sound wrong, it'll sound amateur, it'll sound cheap. And by
Too
at
much
least
risk for the
approximating to
record
some
label.
degree what others are doing and showing you can do it, you show that you're skilled. And I think this is what it comes down to. I've been thinking about this a little bit. You're a runner, Joel, right? Isn't that like your main form of exercise? Like you can time yourself in a run. You can time yourself compared to how fast you ran yesterday. And if you do a local race, you know, how well you place in your age bracket. I do jujitsu, and in jujitsu, it's even more straight ahead than that. It's like one person tapped, the other person didn't. You know, there's a clear winner. We know who's skilled and who isn't. Same thing with chess. I've been taking up chess recently, and it's like, you know who won
What's
each
the
game.
rating?
Like there's no arguing about this. But with music, we don't have these clear winners and losers. And we need, like, the beautiful thing is we can all be a winner, right? Because we can, Neil Young doesn't have, you know, the singing voice of Mariah Carey, but, you know, he has his niche and he can be a winner. But the problem is, like, it's almost hard to know that we're not losers, you know? Like, if you have the unshakable confidence of Joel Wanasek, the thought doesn't even cross your mind that you could be a loser. But for the rest of us, mere mortals, like, how do you know that you're not a loser? And one way to show that is I can copy and approximate what others have done to show my competence. And now let me see if I can remember to do something original. And I think maybe that's where some of the conservatism comes from. I don't want to veer too far away because then people might think I'm not able to do what those other people are able to do. And I don't know what that where it comes from. Do you have thoughts about where it comes from, the homogenization or the desire to stick with known things and be
100%.
emotionally conservative in that way in music production?
It's a psychological bias, right? You've studied psychology and marketing and things like that. And so have I. And, you know, when you study psychology, basically people like to do things that are familiar to them. It makes, you know, people, they feel safe in a pack, in a group. And it's kind of like, we're like lemmings, you know, it's like if everybody started jumping off the pier, we would just get in line and jump off the pier without questioning it. Most of us, not all of us, but
and this is why one of the top comments in the chat is gear space is always wrong. So you said earlier, gear space wrong again. And one of the top comments here is gear space is always wrong, LOL, which I think is absolutely true. So if gear space is telling you you need to go analog console and everyone gear space is telling you that, they're wrong. And if they tell you the exact opposite of that, they're also wrong. So just know that. Go on.
Yeah, look, like anything, we're making art here, and there's a lot of different ways to make art. And as much passionate as I am about hardware and as passionate as you are about your digital workflow, like it's great. Like we'll leave them with this before we go on to the next topic. I think I'll challenge people. And my challenge, and this is the challenge I had, this is where I went through discovery. And I hated music I'm 42. So I hated music that was made in early 80s, 60s, 70s. I've never liked it up until the last few years. And especially mixes from those eras. I didn't understand them up until, because I grew up in the 90s, 2000s, right? So I didn't understand those mixes. Now I get it. So I challenge you to go decade by decade and listen to the biggest hits mixed by the biggest mixers and try to find the sonic beauty in them and try to just listen. How does the song make you feel? Listen to the separation, meaning listen to the space in between instruments, listen to the front to back, the way that things move, the push, the pull, the left to right, the top to bottom, you know, listen to a good experience. You're not going to do this in your headphones or your car while you're driving, you know, sit your ass down in a chair and listen to music the way that it used to be listened to. Like sit down and experience the music, immerse yourself in it, and listen decade by decade, and try to find the sonic beauty. And again, you're going to see major shifts and changes and stuff like that. For me, where that changes and I'm like, wow, we're going in the wrong direction, starts somewhere between 2012 to 2015 sonically. And I started going nuts about this online, and I have my audience, and I have watched a lot of people and at first everybody was like, man, you're out of your mind. I have watched a lot of people come back to gear, and all I'm saying is that give it a chance, put some time into it, and do some listening, and you might start hearing some of the things that I'm hearing, and you might not. At the end of the day, create art however you want to create that inspires you. That's what's important.
Well, I'm going to take a moment to say that I'm actually not passionate about my digital workflow. I am not passionate about gear at all, like not even a little. And maybe this comes from me being raised wrong in the respect that I took the gear space too seriously back when it was called Gear Sluts. I don't think we're allowed to say even its old name anymore. We'll both get
old
canceled.
school. You can say whatever you want here.
Yes. So, you know, I remember there being this block of like, oh, if only I just had this piece of gear then. If only I just had a powerful enough computer to do it at a higher sample rate then. And there were all these excuses and all these reasons for why I couldn't be good enough, and so I wasn't good enough. And I think no matter what it takes for you to be able to say, no, this is good enough, and I'm going to focus now on the art and the artistry of what I'm doing, and I'm going to focus on what's actually important in the mix, whatever it takes to get there is what I'm passionate about, is making this stuff disappear, be something that I don't think about, so that I can focus on the stuff that actually matters. Because so often I get coaching clients or mastering clients, and they come to me asking me specific questions like, and I think referencing is useful. Not that you should specifically copy and try to exactly match other references like you're doing sound-alikes, but like legitimately listen to your favorite records, find out what they actually sound like, and then listen to yours. And just note what the differences are. Even if you're not trying, note how they're different and why. And the biggest things that come up, people think it's going to be stuff like, Justin, am I compressing a little bit too much or a little bit too little, or am I using attacks that are too fast or too slow, or, those things come up. But often when I'm actually listening to their records against their favorite records, it's like, listen to how loud the vocal is compared to your vocal. It's a completely different world. Listen to how loud their bass is compared to your bass in this style. Listen to how much bottom end there is on the bass compared to your bass, or how bright the bass is compared to your bass. Like, completely different world. And you're missing this big picture stuff of, we're listening to a mix and they have like this rhythmic hook in their style is, on this particular track is the backbeat, and 2 and 4 are super accentuated. And what matters in this song is 2 and 4 in the vocal. And you're doing a song with a similar arrangement, a similar style, and your mix is emphasizing the 1, and it's burying the vocal in favor of the guitars. It has nothing to do with what makes your actual song or arrangement work. And like those things, the artistic things, the like what really matters in this mix, whatever makes the technology disappear, so you can find out like what's important in this song at this moment. How do I direct the listener's attention to those things that are working and make those things that distract from what's working be tertiary elements and not pretend that they're primary elements? Like, how do I get that balance right? And when people start listening through that lens, nowhere did I mention gear in any of this. And like, those are where 90% of the wins come from. And I almost feel like the gear that we use to a large degree is about finding the approach to working that suits your personality more than anything. Because last quick thing I'll say about the sound of mixes. I did an episode about great songs with bad mixes, and I have some from every decade of songs that objectively have quote unquote bad mixes. You can name all these things that are wrong with them, but they were major, major songs. And the thing that inspired me is an engineer friend of mine. When the song Happy by Pharrell Williams came out, he was like, I'm listening to the song, it's the biggest song in the world, and like the mix isn't that good. Like the bass, it's really tubby, you can barely hear the kick drum, the hi-hat's way too loud, and it's like, yeah, well, okay, it's resonate with millions of people. Whether or not it's to your liking, whether it's not an aesthetic you dig, me, if you put that song on, like I involuntarily move. And one of the reasons I think that we can hate music so much is we know the power that music has over us to make us involuntarily move and involuntarily emotionally resonate with the person singing to us. And if someone who we potentially shouldn't like or is from the wrong tribe is making us like feel their humanity and move to them, like we have to put our walls up. We have to hate it. We have to be like, no, block, because I know how powerfully that music can suck me in. So anyway, Pharrell Williams Happy, you could talk about all the way the mixes are bad, but what it does is at every single point in the song, it highlights the appropriate rhythmic elements that make people move involuntarily and connect with the song. And it does not matter whether the kick drum is an impressive kick drum you would add to your sample library. The kick drum is secondary. You almost can't hear it under the bass because the bottom end on that track is about what the bass is doing. But what the bass is doing is so secondary to the hi-hat on the 3 on that song. And and then the vocals and then the choruses, it switches from this hi-hat emphasis on 3 to being about the 2 and the 4. And they got all of that stuff right. So it doesn't matter how it sounds. It matters how it ultimately feels to people. So that's my take on whether or not technology matters.
Fair.
Okay. So
I agree with
on to the next stuff. Are there any major more points you want to make about analog before I ask you about mastering? Because someone just asked, is this an interview? Renan, apparently you've never been here. If don't talk at least, this is the first time I haven't talked a 50% equally with my guest. I've let Joel talk more than me because he's the only person who can talk more and faster than me. So Joel's going to come out on top of this one. But any other points you want to make about this whole transition to analog before I ask you about mastering and your changing views?
I think it's good. Like anything, go mix in an analog room if you've never done it. And if you've only mixed analog your whole life, go try mixing on a computer. It's so valuable. And that I feel like puts you in a much more educated position than 98% of people, because most people have not spent adequate time with both and really pushed the time to develop the skill sets to make their own conclusion of what they like.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is also really tricky. The last quick thing I want to say on this topic is the idea of confirmation bias possibly having an impact on us, but also that potentially not mattering. There is this aspect where I know that some analog gear sounds different than its digital counterparts, and I've been able to tell them apart in double-blind tests. And there are some things that sound identical. So there are some things in the world that sound legit different, and some things in the world where if you really properly blindfold yourself and blindfold the other guy too, that you won't be able to differentiate. And there's some things where you can. But what I can say for a fact is that even those things where there isn't a difference, we can hear a difference if we're told the right story. So that factors into things, and that can make you potentially skeptical, and deservedly so. But by the same token, if something is giving you confidence, like just do it, just go with it, even if you haven't gone through that test, if you feel like it's helping you psychologically, emotionally to deliver. Just quick case in point here is Michael Brower. He did a MixCon masterclass for us. I think it was sponsored by Plugin Alliance, and he was using a bunch of their stuff. And I think he used the black box saturator a bunch. And he would turn on the black box saturator, increase the gain on the track, and he'd be like, oh, that sounds so much better. And then he'd move on. And some people in the comments in the chat were like, well, but you didn't level match it. How do you know if it actually sounded better or not? And it's like, dude, he's mixing. Like, it doesn't matter if it actually sounded better level matched or not. The whole mix sounds better. He solved the problem he was seeking to solve, and he can move on. Like, maybe some of the improvement came from turning up the volume and not from the saturation. Totally possible. But this is not when we figure that out. We're working. Just go. If it sounds better, it is better. Even if maybe you made the sound worse if you had turned it down. But if the whole mix is feeling better, keep on going. That's my perspective on it. There's a time to do these listening tests and a time to just like make hay, man.
You're killing me, because if you're making listening tests while you're mixing, you don't understand what mixing is, and you'll never be a mixer. Like, just stop immediately. Like, you don't understand what mixing is. If you're in listening tests, like, never mind. Anyways, you're missing. Yeah, that's amazing that somebody would comment that. Anyways, carry on. Next question.
Well, I don't want to carry on. I want you to carry on, because back when I mastered a track that you did not too long ago, it sounded absolutely gorgeous. I had a mastering client, and I want to set up this story, and then I want to have you take it from here. I had this mastering client where he was doing competent work as a mixer, kind of that, intermediate stage where things sounded good enough. You could hear all the instruments separately, but they weren't sounding like his favorite releases. And, there was a pretty big gap where, honestly, learning a little bit more mixing or having someone else mix it was really the thing. But he brought them to me to master because he really wanted to get better at mixing. So I mastered the thing, and it's one of those projects where I did significant changes, like substantial cuts and boosts, of multiple dB, like more than you're supposed to do in mastering, because of how dark and murky and narrow his stuff was compared to his favorite records. Did all that stuff, potentially overworked it in the eyes of some, but he was thrilled because it sounded so much closer to what final masters in his genre sounded like. Dug it. But he knew that there shouldn't be that as much of a gap, so he wanted to get someone to mix it. And I said, in this style, go see my bro, Joel Wanasek. It's awesome stuff. He's going to do a great job with this. He's going to understand it inside and out. And he did a killer job. You should check out this band. I can't remember the band's name, but they did this modern metal rendition of Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairies by Tchaikovsky. And it was awesome. I mean, it's not like, we're not talking about Trans-Siberian Orchestra here. We're talking like heavy stuff,
Deathcore.
Yeah, I thought it was a really cool, really fun arrangement. And Joel absolutely killed the mix. And he sent it to me to master, and I did nothing to it. And Joel was basically like, please don't do anything to this. It sounds exactly the way I want to sound it. Don't be one of those guys who masters it, like turns all the knobs around trying to impress me. It already sounds how I want it to sound. And I literally basically did nothing to this master almost. He probably did this to me mostly as a kickback of like, you sent me the record, now we'll get it mastered with you. But at that point, you were pretty much mastering all of your own tracks, and I think doing a great job of it, something I often advise against, mastering your own mixes. It's a skill you can develop. And I have to say that the best mixes I get today are the ones that they almost sound like they're mastered by the time that I get them. So I encourage people to lean into processing. But you told me that recently you've changed your tune on this. So you had this unconventional view of you can master your own mixes. I want you to tell me about that view and how it evolved and who you think that's useful for. But now, to my understanding, you've changed again where you're now having other people master for you. Why did that transition happen? So first make me the case for why you can do it, and then make me the case for why you stopped.
Dude, I got a lot to say on this. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. So my mastering credits are, I don't want to say equal. I have some damn impressive mastering credits. And, so I don't consider myself or bill myself as a mastering engineer, but I still probably do 300 to 500 songs a year, which is not like a small feat. You know, there are definitely people that would want that kind of clientele base. So I must be good at it because I get hired for it. But I used to master my own stuff, and I think it's great because, you know, the pros are, look, you can save money. You can, you know, a lot of bands are too cheap to do it. It's one less person you have to pay and sell, and you can keep more of the money, and you can, you know, you can turn in mixes that are more competitive. Say you're in a mix off and this and that. There's a lot of pros for it. And I think you have to differentiate, just like you said, your ability to turn off your mixer and master hat and treat them separately. And most people cannot do that. They're too close to it after mixing. What changed for me is, like I said, my passion is mostly mixing. I love mastering, but I really care about mixing. And I have this concept of levels, and I think about like a video game, right? Like if you go from level 1 to 10, and the skill sets and the mindset that you took you from 1 to 10 is not what's going to get you from 10 to 20 to 20 to 30, 30 to 40. So the same mentality that got you from, let's just say, level 0 to 40 is not what you're going to need to get from level 70 to level 80 in the game. You know what I mean? So as you top out and get better and better and better and better, you have different perspectives that come in. And, you know, I think about the level that I want to play at every day. And I set the absolute highest bar for myself, and that's what I aspire to be. Super mixer. Whether I have the talent or not, I don't know. Time will tell. Whether I'm lucky enough to hit the right band at the right time that'll open that gate, who knows? But in the meantime, it's something I'll work at every day. And I think to myself, you know, if you want to be great, you can't split your attention at things. You know, I know what it's like to multitask. I own multiple businesses. It's like having multiple full-time jobs, but it's hard. And sometimes, but you make it work. So, what happens when you do that is, you know, you can be great at a lot of things, but if you want to be one of the best in the world at something, you know, you can't just show up and be one of the best in the world at multiple things. Unless you are a genetic freak, you might find one or two, you know, because people always point out like the one person that bucks the mold. But for the rest of us mortals, and I don't consider myself more talented or smarter or whatever than anybody else, I just work my ass off like a lunatic. So, as far as I'm concerned, like I reached a certain level where I knew that if I wanted to jump up to the next level in my game and start getting another level of work and start, you know, up my game sonically, I needed to find a mastering engineer that could do that. Now, my problem with mastering engineers is I've been to a lot of mastering engineers, usually by force, because I'm like, dude, I'd rather master my own stuff. I know exactly how I want it to sound. The band approved it, blah, blah, blah. I would sit there and argue 2 years ago till I was blue in the face of why I should be the person to do this. Now I feel totally different because my experience with mastering engineers is if I can tell what you did to my master, I'm never going to hire you again. Meaning I don't want somebody like, if I hear that I sent it off to big name person and I hear that they used Pro Q3 on it and this limiter, like the invisible limiter or whatever, and I hear that because I'll hear it because I know this is what I do for a living. I'd be like, I can do that myself. That's not what I'm paying you to do. You know, well, it's an extra perspective. What I want from a mastering engineer is somebody that takes my music and brings it to the next level in terms of emotional impact of the song. You know what I mean? And I found that person, and it took me a long time. And the interesting thing is 10 years ago, when I tried that person for the first time, I wasn't good enough to hire him, meaning that, and the person I use, I should say, is Mauer Applebaum. Mauer is a legend. I think Mauer 60 million records or something. I mean, Mauer is just an absolute titan in the mastering game. And what I love about Mauer, and you should have him on this, by the way, he's one of the smartest.
I've interviewed Mauer at least twice.
One of the smartest, most passionate dudes in the game. And, you know, you want to talk about a gear nerd. Oh my God.
Yes, he is.
You
He
think
makes
I'm
his own.
opinionated? Get him on. So, you know, the thing is with Mauer is like 10 years ago when I had him do my work, I was just like, nah, like this is like a 0.5%. Now, when I get something back from him, I'm like, wow, I don't know what you did, but it's better. You know what I mean? Like I can't sit there and break it down from, I can't turn my mastering hat on and break it down into a series of moves in a computer or a series, you know, so whatever he does, he's got his sauce. And, you know, I mean, sure, I can hear like EQ or imaging things, but there's just a way he brings out emotion in my work that not only I hear, the artists, the managers, you know, the on all levels, they feel it, they hear it. They're like, wow, this, like, you know, so I found that person and it took me a very long time. And every time I end up going to a different mastering engineer, usually by force, we always
Mhm.
end up back to Mawar because I'm like, I always send them an email this long about why they totally effed up my mix. I'm like, if I wanted you to change my bottom end and tighten it, I would have
Yeah.
tightened it. You know, I know how to
Mhm.
mix. You don't have to tell me that my bottom end is flubby or like this is intentional and we
Yeah.
approved it. Why did you narrow my bottom by 30% and blah, blah, blah? Like, what are you doing? You know, like, so
I've
like,
had the same exact experience. But it's funny because there is that levels component comes back into it again, where there are certain clients I get, the mix sounds practically mastered when it comes in, and my job is basically not to mess it up and to try to do tiny little things to maybe
right.
edge a bunch of different tracks that are supposed to be on an album together so that they flow a little bit more seamlessly into one the other. And
Yeah.
I sometimes in those cases feel like I have to justify things. Like I feel that there's a way more 50 hertz happening on track 3 than on track 4, but I also feel that was intentional. And I don't want to compromise that. You're clearly going for a subbier feel on track 3 than track 4, and I'm not going to try to iron out those differences because that is clearly an aesthetic choice. But what if we softened it by 3/4 of a dB? Would the transition from one track, feel better than the other? And we're talking about relatively minor things. But there's this other level where there are people who are absolutely thrilled that I did all of the things that you're describing that I shouldn't do to a Joel Wanasek mix, and they're excited that I did those things because they were afraid to do them in the mix. So I
Some
think
people
that's
need it.
yes, there's that degree of levels comes into play. But I had the same exact experience where, especially back then when I was doing more mixing, maybe 2014, and or I was still doing some mixing. I want to say I almost completely stopped mixing by 2013, but from 28 through 2014, when I was doing, I think, most of my best mixing, but we would occasionally work with these mastering engineers who were back then like $50 a track. And not once did the master ever come back sounding better. And not once did it ever come back feeling like they respected that we already got the sounds that we wanted. And they were just trying to either do their thing or try to
They were trying to
impress us in
mix
ways that weren't impressive. Yeah. Like,
100%.
and so many of them came back worse. But I also think that there's this caliber thing where you're less likely to experience people once you get to this, $120 and up price range on mastering engineers, that they're less likely to want to wow you and impress you. And I think there's a lot of people who are charging $50 and $60 a master or less who feel like they need to wow you and impress you and justify the rate and prove themselves. Whereas myself, or you go to Bob Ludwig, who's way more than me, or, whoever, they don't need to impress you. So if they do nothing and say, pay me my rate anyway, like they're
Yeah.
already confident enough that they cannot touch it and know that that was the right thing to do. And you have to work with people who worked with great people before who understand that. Mauer has worked with great people before, and not every mastering engineer out there has. So I think that's a difference.
I'll tell you an interesting thing that changed for me in the last week, and this is his fault. Because I've now mixed probably somewhere between 70 and 100 songs with Mauer in the last 2 years, and I'm trying to involve him in everything I do because he always takes whatever I do up a level. And if he doesn't get it the first time, he's got it on the second. He actually usually sends me like 5 different versions of a song, and we'll pick in different directions. It gets we go down rabbit holes. But he said something interesting to me, and he was talking about my trajectory and all the quantum leaps I've made in my work and this and that. 'Cause I've been friends with him for 15 years, and he knows my work very well. And I was like, all right, like here, here's the goal. Here's what I'm trying to get to. And, and he's done masters for people like Ben Gross and Chris Lord Alge and Colin Richardson and just some of the greatest mixers to ever live. And he's like, what the difference between your work and those guys are? He's like, the next thing you need to stop doing. I'm like, what's that? He's like, you got to stop being a mastering engineer when you're mixing and mixing through that frame. I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? He's like, you're top down mixing. He's like, knock that crap off. I'm like, why? Cause those are old habits left from me from Joey land where, it's like, I might have like max bass and like a Lin multiband or something on the thing and like an EQ or, you know what I mean? Just like, it's like having bus
You're mixing
processing.
into a mastering chain that's supposed to make the thing sound finished.
Right. So instead just mix into a limiter, but he said, instead of mixing top down, he says, why are you putting all that crap on your bus? He's like, dude, Colin Richardson, when I get mixes from him, like he's just got a limiter on it. I get something from CLA. There's a limiter on the reference for the loud and that's it. There's no mastering plugins or whatever. He's like, all that crap is smearing out your mix and it's negative. He's like, why don't you get your tracks to sound that badass in the mix level instead of just relying on the master bus to do it heavier handed? He's like, you'll get more microdynamics in your stuff and subtler movements. And that's one of the things that you're missing that those guys have that you're getting there towards. So I changed that in my workflow this week and holy crap, he was right.
That is something that I often recommend to people. And it's there in the Mixing Breakthroughs course where I, talk about mixing strategies. And one of them is if you're going to do top-down mixing, my general recommendation, just based on the way that so many of the top level people I've studied do it, is that instead of trying to use your master bus to do so much of this top-down mixing, if you're going to do top-down mixing, go to subgroups. Like there are a lot of people who are mixing at a high level who are doing significant bus processing, but they're not doing it at the final bus level. They're doing it at the subgroup level. And there's some people who are doing it more at the individual track level and it's personal taste and all that. But there are like Brower is obviously a key example of he's mixing into like 4 different groups, but there's so many people who've come to that idea of, I kind of want that gel that we get through master bus processing, but I want to be able to dig in harder and have it more tailored and have it more control over it. So what if I were to do that kind of thing on the subgroup level rather than on the final group level? Do you find yourself leaning more heavily into subgroup buses or more heavily into individual tracks to do some of the stuff that you were doing on the master bus before?
For me, it's 50. I would say it's equally spread out. I don't really throw a lot of plugins, obviously because I own Nail to Mix, I've watched, 6 years of people mix 12 a year of all the top mixers in heavy music. And like, some of the bus change, like people have on, they might have like 10 plugins on their mix bus. And like, I've seen some crazy stuff, but Maor said, he's like, there hasn't been like a truly great mixer that's really emerged in the last 10 to 12 years. It's not like the old days. And he's like,
well, part of that might be economic and structural, right? Because
sure.
somewhat fracturing, as homogenized as things have been, we're also somewhat fracturing at the same time into slightly more decentralized music production where you don't have all of the budgets being funneled through these few companies that then select like the 20 guys who are going to mix everything in the world.
I guess I'm talking about at the top of the game, not necessarily like, I understand like the home studio economics and like, that's how I came up. I mean, so for me,
when the tower, like, here's the thing, if you're paying the top, you can get to the top of the game of like, I'm in the highest floor of the Tower of Babel. But when the Tower of Babel collapses and we all spread out, like there's no more highest floor anymore. There is no more top of the game. And some people who are just as talented as those people aren't necessarily given the same types of budgets and the same type of exclusivity, even though they might exist. But that said, there's also the other economics aspect where back in the 90s, people were really, really attracted, really high performing, talented people who could have made it in other fields were really attracted to say, I'm going to make it in music because of how great the rewards are there. With the rewards not being the same, some people who might have gone into music like, in another generation now go into other fields.
And the reason I'll say that is I think budgets are going up because I work in LA. Even though I don't live there.
They're going back up. Yeah.
I know what people are getting per track, producers. I know what mixers are getting, and it's, I see fees going up and I've seen money come back. And again, I can only speak for my personal observations and my contact group and stuff, but it seems like we're finally trending in a better direction. And all I'm saying is like, people will complain about budgets.
Part of that's inflation, but yes, you're right.
Yeah, well, okay, we could talk about inflation. Dude, okay, that's a whole other conversation. But
yes,
excluding that and the complete devaluing of the dollar and bricks and all this stuff. And but anyways, I will tell you that I see budgets going up, and they've been trending up for a while. The fees that some people get like are crazy, and I'm not talking like. people, we're not talking people that have like 90s level success or 2000s level success because the budgets were crazier back then. But I'm just saying, like, it's getting, I've seen some interesting things and heard some pretty crazy numbers floating around LA. And it's like, I mean, even going to LA versus say Nashville, it's a whole nother pay tier because of how expensive it is to live there.
Oh, yeah.
So it's like, a good mix rate in Nashville is like $2,500 a song, and you're not going to get a point in country. And LA, the prices go way up, man. And then there's points, and like, so it's different genres at different.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Speaking of economics, I've been having so much fun talking to you that I've totally forgot to do a deeper sponsor shout out. I want to ask you a couple more questions and see if there's any more additional questions from the audience. If you guys have audience questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'm going to read some out. I don't want to keep Joel forever. We've been already on here for about an hour and 10 minutes. So hopefully we can keep this, from becoming like, 3.5 hour podcast. So what I do have to do though is give the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors. And our sponsors include you. How do you sponsor this podcast? The best way to sponsor this podcast is to sponsor yourself. First of all, consider becoming a member of the SonicScoop YouTube channel. Joel is going to think I'm absolutely insane for pricing this at $5 a month, where you get access to members-only Q&As and members-only mix feedback sessions where we listen to your mixes together, listen to some amazing sounding tracks in your style, listen to your mixes, talk about exactly what you can improve. We have a whole bunch of members here in the chat right now: Music 7 Studios, Dark Trap, Benj, Isomatic. There's a whole bunch of you guys in here. And if you want to become a member, you can do it for $5 a month. That's an absolutely stupid price. I should probably double it and it would be too cheap. So get on that if you want access to me answering any and all of your questions, giving you personalized mix feedback. Even better way to sponsor yourself, however, is with one of our great full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, or Compression Breakthroughs. Each of them will improve the way that you work forever for the better, guaranteed, or your money back. 30-day money back guarantee on all of them. Easily the most useful stuff I've ever done. Mixing Breakthroughs is a whole system for mixing that has been distilled based on the past decade I've done of interviewing some of the best mixers on the planet. Compression Breakthroughs is an epic course that's about teaching you to hear, understand, and use compression like a pro. And sneak peek EQ Breakthroughs is going to come out on September 25th, so stay tuned for that. And also Mastering Demystified. If you want to learn everything I know about mastering, what I do there, I now have gold and platinum mastering credits, so apparently the stuff that I know about mastering has not kept the artists I work with from getting hundreds of millions of streams, so good for them, and I didn't mess it up that badly. So if you want to also not mess up your client's stuff badly and probably make it sound better, Mastering Demystified is a great course. Also a plug for all the stuff that Joel Wanasek's doing, including what would be the best places for people to learn more with you, Joel?
Oh, urm.academy, or you could nailthemix.com. Of course, we have all of the wonderful drum sample libraries and software we make at drumforge.com. And if you want me to mix your song for you, it's mixedbyjoel.com.
Sweet. All right. Oh, I want to plug myself even more. I do mastering too, guys. I don't plug myself that much for mastering, but I'm thinking, Joel, and one of the reasons I want to have you on is I'm thinking about going more in that direction of doing more mastering these days, because it's like one of these things where like next year I'm either going to have to double down on YouTube or double down on mastering. And, you'll
wake up smiling more doing mastering. I already went through this entrepreneurship phase, and man, I love being back in the game, even though I don't need to, if that makes sense.
Yeah. This is one thing that I think is important about your story, Joel, is that you are financially successful. You run multiple companies in the business, and companies that are probably more lucrative outside the business, I'd imagine. And you don't necessarily need to be mixing to butter your bread. That said, you're doing stuff that there's so many people out there right now who are probably doing this kind of work and wish they were richer. And you should get richer. You should figure out how to charge more. But Joel, after spending all this time figuring out how to make more money running these businesses, it's like, man, what do I really wake up and want to do that like gives me joy and makes me feel like I'm having this positive impact in my own life and in the lives of others? And it's doing some of the work that maybe you're already doing. So like there's value in that. Like even, and I want to encourage all of you, if you get into audio, you should shoot for 6 figures and above being in audio. Like you can do that. It's totally achievable. Yeah. But even if you don't, or even if it takes you a while to get there, you can potentially enjoy this process of getting there. So I think it's another thing to be aware of. And then the last shout outs I have to give on sponsorships are Sound Toys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. Joel, I have a standing invitation for you. If you want to do a video about Sound Toys, on the SonicScoop channel, 100% could get sponsored, and they'd love to hear how you would torture some of these devices in heavy music mixing, or if you want to show off your pop mixing chops in a way that you can't show them off on your usual channels where they just expect you to do nothing but heavy music. Now you come and bring like the pop or the other stuff to our channel so you don't alienate them. You find new people into that stuff. If you want Joel to do videos on our channel, let us know in the chat and the comments. We'd love to have him on. So that's another thing. Sound Toys, try out their stuff and tell Joel, harass him until he comes and does a guest post on our channel. Also, last but not right, good stuff. Also, last but not least is Ultimate Support Stands. I've owned a ton of music stands over the years, and I have had a ton of Ultimate Support Stands over the years. They have, in general, not sucked. And most mic stands most of the time suck. This is probably, I've tried, I think 3 different broadcast stands now. And this is, I think, the best designed broadcast mic stand I've tried so far. It's a really nice one. It's called the Broadcast Mic Stand. Check these guys out over at ultimatesupportstands.com, sponsoring the podcast this month as well. With all that sponsorship stuff out of the way, can I ask you a question about your approach to mastering? Because I want to use the one track I mastered for you when you were basically mastering your own stuff and didn't use mastering engineers, and I basically didn't do anything to the track. The only thing I could have done to that track would be to listen to other records in the style and say, to make it sound a little bit more like other records in the style, I'm going to have to make it sound slightly less impressive. And that's like all I could have done would be like turn it down slightly and make it sound slightly less impressive. Like it was just, quick sip test reaction, like this thing screams, like blows your hair back. And the only thing I could have done would be like, yeah, if you want to sound more like records in this style, I can make it sound like somewhat less good or something, But my question is, like, now that you're not doing all this mastering processing, and now that the things that you're describing about liking about analog and liking about older style releases are a little contradictory to that beautiful sounding, really hyped up, amped up, bombastic mix that you sent to me to master. And when I hear you talking about the spirit of mixing on a console and digging back into these older styles of mixes that have more space and that have this greater front to back and all that, some of that potentially comes from less limiting, less hype, less impressiveness in an immediate sip test. Like when you listen to a 1970s Joni Mitchell record that's like really well produced, even if you don't like the style, and you put it up against a modern release, you'd be like, this thing sounds like crap. It's not loud and it doesn't have like the big bottom and top. But if you stop for a second and listen to the whole record, like on really good speakers at an appropriate volume, and you don't listen to it back to back with other releases that are louder and more limited, you might listen to one of these 70s recordings and be like, whoa, this is gorgeous. I've never heard anything that sounds this gorgeous. And you can go into some of those old records that are less limited in a way that you can't with something that's really bombastic and really brutal. So has your perception changed at all in A, how loud you want to make things at the mixing stage, and B, how limited it should get in the mastering stage? Or is it just completely context and genre and project dependent?
You said some interesting things there. I don't think, first off, I reject that my love for analog has anything to do with making my stuff sound older or more like rolled off or less aggressive, because that's not modern mixing. I'm a modern mixer, so I have to compete against other. So first off, in the last 2 years, my stuff has actually gotten about 3 dB louder.
Wow. Right.
Probably, yeah. I mean, the LUFS that I'm hitting, it's not that I want to be this loud, but what comes out of LA is just stupid right now. It's so loud. It's like, if I don't turn something in at like 4.5 LUFS or -5, people are like, what the, you know what I mean? So you have to learn how to mix good at that level and get your stuff that loud. And which I always turn it in so loud, it's stupid. But again, not because I think it sounds better. I like my stuff slammed because I mix aggressive music. I mean, hard rock, some metal. Everybody thinks I'm a metal guy. I'm not a metal guy. I mix some metal and I have some metal credits, and, I have nailed the mix, but I'm a rock person through and through. And I do more pop and rock and stuff than, anything else. But, what was I saying? Something about limiting levels.
You're talking about still wanting to keep things loud, and your LUFS has actually creeped up. So when you're talking about hitting -5 and -4.5, you're talking about at the mixing stage, you're hitting those levels.
Oh yeah. I always mix into a limiter and always turn that in and get that approved. And the reason why is if I turn in a mix that's at a mix level where you have headroom, the A&R person, I don't trust that their brain is evolved enough to turn up their stereo and compare it to the other guy that I'm in the text mix. Because if I turn it in and TLA and Ben Gross and Zach Cervini and 4 other dudes have turned in their mixes slammed, and I'm the quiet guy, they're gonna be like, this mix sucks. They can't. It's like walking into my mom playing the acoustic guitar version. Like, imagine this produced, and she'll be like, I don't know if I like this song. I'm like, no, there's going to be strings and there's going to be this and there's going to be this kind of, and she'll just be like, she doesn't get it because she's not a producer. So that's how I feel about the rest of the world. So you got to turn it in like demolished, because like if you're going to go up against anybody doing anything top level right now, they're turning it in demolished. I even have my mixes mastered for test mixes. I call my and I'm like, dude, you're doing this and let's win together. So, it's brutally competitive. And I don't think that analog has actually hindered that in any way. In some way, it's made it better for me. Like, I can get my mixes with way louder, with way more bottom end than I've ever been able to. I can get way more movement and depth and front to back. I can get more width. I can get more. I get more of everything that I want in my mixes. That all of the good characteristics of older stuff, but it sounds modern. And more importantly, I have a unique sound that nobody can copy, meaning that I have certain gear tones that I've been curating with my assistant, Joe. We've been working very hard on to create a sound, a sonic signature, right? And not including the way we interpret the music and all that stuff. But like the gear you work on has a tone. You mix in an SSL, it sounds like an SSL. You can't make it sound like a Neve. You know what I mean? Period. It just doesn't. So, those signatures have been favorable to that kind of work, because if everybody's mixing in the box that I'm competing against, and all of a sudden I come out with something analog and it moves differently, my artists hear this stuff. I was on the phone the other day with a pop artist. She does like 2 million monthly. She's very well known. She's almost platinum. And, and she was like, you're the first mixer I've ever hired in my entire life where I haven't had 3 pages of notes. And I'm like, really? And I've just did the 4th song for her, and she's had 1 note, because I changed the tuning on 1 note because I thought it was out of key. Then I learned it was deliberate. So, she was like, she's like, I can't explain it, but there's a way that your mixes move, a certain impact I've never felt before in my songs, a certain way where it just jumps out of the speakers. And she's like, whatever you got going on over there with that console, it's got some magic in it. I'm like, yeah, analog, she's like, it sounds like a modern pop mix, but there's more. There's a dimension, a depth, a life to it that other things don't have. And, it's like, I hear this all the time from clients. They notice it. And I'm, obviously sometimes I'll be out there selling it, but a lot of times I'm not. And it's just like, they hear it and then they're like, wow, I'm not used to hearing this sound. So you can mix super modern with older tools, because again, I'm using a ton of plugins and stuff like anybody else, right? And all these advanced techniques. But at the end of the day, adding the good parts of analog, which is not recall, which is not ease of use, which is not the cost of entry, which is not the cost of maintenance, all of those things suck. What's good about it though is the tone, the way it sounds, the way it brings things together, but keeps them separated, and that's what
I have to ask you a question that you prefaced by saying this would be the most terrible. This would be a question that would make you mad if someone asked it in the chat. So now I have to ask it of you. Which is you're like, people are going to push back against it so much. It's going to be so controversial. And someone's going to ask, but Serban Ganea does it all with a mouse. Why can't you, Joel? So let me pretend that someone asked that question in there, and we'll throw that question that you preemptively disliked at you. Why is that a bad question?
You're right, because Serban is the only person that's ever mixed a record that we should care about. I love Serban's work. I mean, he's great at what he does and stuff like that. But CLA disagrees. TLA disagrees. Andy Wallace disagrees. How many great mixers can we can cherry pick one person, this person mixes in the box. They say that blah, 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 blah. Like, people always use this one extreme argument. They grab, I don't want to say the exception because most people are in the box now, but they'll always like find one thing, be like, well, the most famous this and that is blah, blah, blah. It's like, it has nothing to do with anything. It's like, okay, somebody mixes one genre. It's like, have you ever heard a pop mixer mix metal? It's like the worst sounding thing I've ever.
Right. And I wonder if some degree of gear choice is genre dependent, because I'm wondering if the whole set of choices you're making, if it would make sense for someone who's, doing trap, hip hop, or for someone who's doing, a certain type of kind of pop, like, would it be the best approach for them? I don't know who's mixing, I guess there's so many different mixers doing like The Weeknd these days. Yeah, I guess that's one other question is, do you have to know, like, in your style, what's the appropriate toolkit to help get you there faster? And
Well,
if you
I
were
mean,
in
do
a
you want
different
to sound like
style, could you see adopting a different tool set for that style?
you want to sound like everybody else, or do you want to sound like you? I mean,
Mhm.
that's again, this is a levels question. At a certain level, you just copy other people's stuff, their chains, their ideas, their styles.
Yep.
At a certain point, you blossom and you become you. You're an artist, and you're handed an easel and you paint with it. And you have a unique view and perspective on the world as a mixer. You know, there's only one Ben Gross. There's only one Chris Lord-Alge. There's only one Serban. There's only one Andy Wallace. You know, all of these people hear differently and have a set of tools and a certain, who's to say who's right or wrong. They all have a million Grammys and this and that. And obviously certain genres are more popular than others. Like more people like, say, rap than like rap 30 years ago, or less people like rock or this or that. So trends come, they go, they change. The pendulum swings both who's right, who's wrong. It doesn't matter. What matters, I think, is that, like I said earlier, anybody just finds a thing. Because like I said, for every mixer that mixes in the box, we can find another great mixer who mixes all analog, and we can find somebody who mixes hybrid, or, you know, it's hard to know who's using what.
The idea of there being levels is interesting because, again, this is something where I have to bring back that analogy we were talking about before for a different topic. Because again, when you're running, Joel, you know, if you're running a race, who is the fastest that day and whether or not you're beating your old records or you're falling behind. And when it comes to something like jujitsu, you could take an untrained person and put them against a trained person, and they're just going to die. Like there's nothing that they can do, and they'll immediately recognize that there are levels. And as soon as they start training, and they could be training for 2 years and become the kind of person who at jujitsu could tie someone else into knots, they know that there's another level that can tie them into knots. And they know that there's another level that can tie their coach into knots. And they get to see the empirical evidence of it. Like, this is undeniable. And it's the same thing with Usain Bolt, and you check your times against Usain Bolt, you know, and you know that there are people who are so much faster than you, but then there's a faster guy. And we objectively see those levels. But with music, it's tricky because there's always this possibility that you just got your station, you just got into your position because of nepotism, because of favoritism, because of you were born rich and I wasn't, and all of these other
There's
reasons.
always Dunning-Kruger too, which is my favorite thing to witness. Everybody always thinks they're better than they are because that's the way our brains work. I mean, look at American Idol.
And that's the way that it is when you consider how good you are at running or at jujitsu before you try to get good. Every guy thinks they can fight until they fought someone who can fight. Everyone thinks that, you know, they're pretty well, maybe not everyone thinks they're pretty athletic. Maybe some people have an understanding that they're not. But even the people who aren't athletic think they can fight until they actually do. But so yes, we have that bias of we think we're better than we are. But there is some reality to the fact that some people got more breaks than others. Now, that said, I've seen people who've gotten so many breaks and they still turned into nothing. Because they didn't work hard, they didn't have the ambition, they were unpleasant to get along with, they didn't actually care about the craft of it. That's not the part they were interested in. They were interested in the prestige without the craft. And although they got all of these, there have been so many studios that I visited that went out of business, that were gorgeous builds, that never did anything. People had so many advantages, and they didn't make it. And there's so many other people who have had fewer advantages, and other people who have had advantages who have made it. So it's clearly not just that. But there's still that story we could tell ourselves that we can't tell ourselves about running. We can't say that Usain Bolt only got there because, right? But we can say that, oh, that guy in the studio, if I had the same breaks as him, I'm just as talented and would have gotten there. I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that we cannot see so clearly the levels that exist until you get really good. And only when I started to get really good at mastering did I start to really notice the difference in some of my clients. And only when I started really teaching other people to get better did I see the levels between, like, people complain about how much Taylor Swift sucks. And then I listen to their track and it's like, nope, Taylor Swift's actually pretty good. She's actually pretty good what she does.
She's incredible.
And you suck right now. And not until you objectively go, wow, there's something that those people are doing right, even if it's not to my taste, that I don't have that level yet. But I have some clients who I will do a master and they will literally tell me everything I did in the master. You know, not literally every single thing, but they'll be like, oh yeah, I feel like you brought down about a half dB at 100 Hertz. I'm wondering if it should be 80. And I'm like, did you open my session? Like, how did you know, you know? But like, there are some people who have that level of ear, and there are some people who go, what did you do? And it's just interesting to see those levels, but you can't see those levels when it comes to music until you're good. Whereas in some other endeavors in life, you can see those levels before you're good. So that's one of our challenges, I think, in this field.
Yeah, 100%. I'll add, I've had a direct hand in the education of somewhere between 20,000 to 30,000 engineers that have subscribed to URM, or I'd have to go look up the number, but it's a lot. And in this, we have all these feedback systems and, monthly mixing competitions. And I've watched people of all different skill levels. You're right. Until you get insanely good at this and like really high level, you can always see the levels below you clearly. Like I can look back to where my mentality 5 years ago when I see all the flaws in it. I can go back 10 years ago and remember when I thought I was getting pretty good and I didn't even realize how far off I was. Like I remember like 2012 sitting in my car listening to like some Ben Death and CLA mixes, and I'm listening to this. I'm like, my drum sounds are like right there. And, I feel like I'm so close. I didn't realize how far off. I'm like, just because your drum sounds are like EQ, it's just like, there's different levels. And until you get to the higher levels, you don't look back and you can look down and realize what it's really eye opening. So, you can sit back and you're just like, oh, you don't get it yet, but you'll get it in 20 years. So, that's the fun thing about growth. So one thing I've noticed teaching this to so many people around the globe is that, man, this is a really hard skill. I think most people think that they're better than they are. Most people tend to overcomplicate things and shoot themselves in the foot, especially more inexperienced people. I will find that there is always an element of luck to this business where sometimes you could have two people of equal skill, but somebody just hits the right band at the right time and then gets all the gigs and, just overshadows somebody because, there's a lot of politics in this business and, you can win a mix off, but lose the mix. It's happened to me. On some very big artists where it's like they went with somebody where everybody felt producer, the artist, that I had the much better mix, but they wanted the person's name for radio. And then they got to go, it happens. It's okay. It happens to everybody. But at the end of the day, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. I will say this, when you get in the room with the top tier, like for example, one of the best metal people in the world is Daniel Bergstrand. And having sat in the room for like a week with that guy, and when you watch him work, you just see how much better he is than everybody else. And like, even though he's not in favor right now, in 2000 through 2012, he was like one of the it people in metal and did all the baddest bands and all the sickest, like, just, he was like one of the dudes to beat. And just like, when you sit in the room with this person and you listen to his raw tones, you realize the level of genius that person is and how good they are. And then think about how good they were at the age versus how good you were. And like, you can really feel these things again, like you said, from experience. So I have the unique position where I can sit on the Eagles Tower to some degree because of all the teaching that I've done. And I can see such a large pool of people and their skill levels. And I can put them into groups mentally and notice trends between them and how they're thinking and what struggles they're going through. And it's very fascinating because, again, you have a unique perspective on that too. I mean, very few people in the world have our perspective because they don't have, and they haven't built what we've built. So, they don't have students. They can't watch what it's like to see 10,000 people, broken down into skill levels and submit into a competition monthly, and then listen to all of that work and compare it and then see what the best of that group are doing and how long they've been working and still how far off they are from the person who actually mixed the song. So, I've had the unique ability to do that. So I think I don't know. To me, it's just interesting. I don't really have a greater point with that other than just
I think there's a lot of truth in that. The only one thing I want to add to it, just so we don't come across as too elitist, is that I did get a glimmer in your story of something that probably has occurred to all of us at one point, which is that you were comparing your work to work that you had done before, years earlier, and was like, oh man, it was actually, there was something that I had like 2 or 3 years ago that I don't have now. And you answered it with, it must have been the gear back then I was doing the hybrid stuff. And maybe that is part of the story, and part of that is true. But there's another aspect of things where sometimes we're in a state in our lives where we're not overcomplicating things and we're not second guessing ourselves, and we're kind of in a flow where we're just boldly making creative decisions about what feels good instead of what sounds good. So we get mixes that feel really good. And I have definitely noticed a trajectory that happens with some people where some people will start off on, Fruity Loops or whatever, FL Studio or whatever, and they'll make their first beats and they'll be like pegged into the red and they're doing everything wrong with their session organization and they're putting reverbs on the inserts, which you're not supposed to do because it's not efficient. It's using them in an octave or whatever.
For 15 years.
Yeah. But then they'll have these first few tracks and they're actually like banging. And they'll like annoy people who've been doing it for a while because it's this kid who came out of nowhere and is doing some banging sound and tracks. And then they start to learn, and for a little while they get worse. And they have to look back at their earliest stuff when they were like, man, I had something then. And now all this gear that I've bought since, all these tips that I've learned, I just am worse now. And that's sometimes what getting better looks like, is that there's like these ups and downs along the way, but there's also you getting technically better doesn't always mean you're getting creatively better and remembering how to connect with the feel of the song and all that stuff.
There's another dimension that's important with that, I think. And when it comes to like getting better, I had a post the other day about mixing and why mixing is expensive. And it really resonated with a lot of people. And it was interesting to me is I said something about, people would say, think about a mixer. Like if you find one genre and one niche where you come up with like a sound that people think is banging and you just do the same thing, you're not a mixer. That's somebody, a producer can do that. Like a mixer is somebody who can take a wide variety of things and compete. Like you can mix pop competitively, you can mix rock competitively, you can mix, no matter what somebody throws you, you can do it on time. You can do it consistently, no matter how crappy the source level is, and put it out and make it consistently good. That's a mixer. Okay. You might get lucky once is what I'm saying. And beginners will do that and then come up with a sound that pops. But the problem is as soon as that changes and that market changes and people don't want that, that person is screwed if they don't grow. So I think it's important to also be aware of that you can come up with something that's wrong or whatever, or come up with something that's hits, but getting good is not being able to do that in one spot, but being able to continually do that across a system. You know what I mean? That's the difference between good, okay, and incredible. Like, CLA can mix probably any song in the world and do a pretty damn phenomenal job at it, better than almost anybody. So, you know what I mean? Like, regardless of the genre, not saying he's the right fit. Maybe Serban might be better at a pop song or whatever. But what I'm saying is that he's a real mixer. You know what I mean? Like the guy can mix, period. So, I think it's important to also say that what's important mostly is a growth mentality. Like every day, I'm sure you're like this too, Justin. I wake up and try to get better at this. I study it. I think about it. All I do is try to get better at every day, just a little bit. You know what I mean? And I've been doing that my whole life and it's never going to stop. This isn't something you wake up and you get 10 years in and you're like, okay, I'm done. I've got platinum records and this and that. I don't need to get better anymore. It's a lifelong pursuit. And the people that last, not that have a hot moment for 3 years and then fizzle out, but the people that last in this game are the people that are like that. And as you go around and you talk to them, and you've been in the room with a lot of big mixers and stuff, the people that have lasted, they all have the same personality type in terms of like what they think is important, how they spend their time, what they value. They're all self-educating. They're constantly trying to up their game. They're hard workers. You know what I mean? Like very rarely do you find somebody who's like an outlier in that type of mentality.
Yeah. Well, great stuff. I think this is a beautiful place to start winding it down. If you guys have any last minute questions for Joel, please type them into the chat box and we can read out questions here. There's been a lot of conversation about the ideas, but not so much in the way of direct questions. If you got one, feel free to throw it in there. I'm going to give one last shout out to sponsors and one last reminder to go follow Joel. You can follow Joel over at the Joel Wanasek YouTube channel, which we have linked down in the description. And also, would you say the other big channel to follow you on would be the URM channel, Unstoppable Recording Machine?
Yeah.
Because Nail the Mix doesn't have its own channel, right?
Yeah, it does. But I do a lot of like Instagram content and stories. That's where I get really nuts is like my IG stories. I'm always, to me, it's like a thought dump, if that makes sense, where I'm always like, diving into I'm always making mixing content. That's just Joel Wanasek. But yeah, I mean, if you want to learn how to mix rock, heavy music and stuff like that, definitely nailthemix.com. I've taught tons of stuff over there, but so have a lot of other great people. And, we're very passionate and dedicated to making people better at this stuff.
Cool stuff. All right. Before I ask the last minute questions here, one more shout out to our sponsors, SoundToys, sponsoring the podcast this month, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. And also these guys who make the ultimate support stands. I'm talking to the Shure SM7B right now, which is a fairly heavy microphone on this ultimate support stand. Their broadcast mic stands are a great one. I've owned many ultimate support stands over the years, and they have not sucked. And there are many sucky brands of mic stands out there. I actually probably have several. It's funny, when I moved from like my old studio, I noticed this when Ultimate Support reached out. It was one of the reasons I got involved with them when they reached out. I'm like, you know what? I realized I have 3 microphone stands that still work from when I last bought microphone stands, like in 2010 or something. And I probably had like 50, and most of them got sold or got given to other people or broke over the years. And I have like 3 left. And I looked at them and I'm like, 2 out of 3 of these that made it all these years are ultimate support stands. So, okay, I have 2 decade-old mic stands from these guys. So we're in good shape.
Quality.
So check those guys out. Also, remember to cajole Joel into doing guest post. We can get Sound Toys to sponsor him, doing some pop mixes on our channel, which I think would be awesome. We'll see him outside of his usual familiar context of metal. That would be great. So here are some of our last minute questions. Ryan Harris asks, I think I can answer this one for Joel. What is his opinion on mastering with headphones? Now, my guess is I asked Joel, do you want to do this podcast with some headphones on so we won't like have any bleed? He looked around the studio. I'm like, I don't think I have headphones in here. So more and more people are mixing on headphones these days. But Joel, you don't have a set of headphones in your studio from what I understand. What are your thoughts on doing anything in headphones? Where do you think they're useful or not useful?
5 years ago, I would have been the person that would say don't. There are a couple of guys that I've seen that pull it off that do good mixes on headphones. I just prefer speakers. I don't know. I feel like you can't EQ properly in headphones. I know there are people that disagree with me strongly, but I've never heard a pair of headphones in my entire life. And I've listened to a lot because every year at NAMM, they're like, dude, you got to hear this. You got to come check this out. We got the best this. And I listen to them and I start throwing on the mix reel. And I'm just like, man, how can you EQ the mid-range of a distorted guitar on these? You can't. It's impossible. So again, whatever you mix on, I get it. Not everybody's got a treated room with a sub. I'm more of like, get nice speakers and get a sub. Or I guess how many hits have been mixed on NS10s, right?
Mm-hmm.
I got to wire mine up. But
yeah, I mean, the headphones, what they could, even if your headphones, you couldn't make good mixing decisions on them in the mid-range and say that was the case, then if you don't have a good treated room, you could potentially have headphones that would tell you accurate things, maybe below 100 hertz. The problem is most headphones don't tell you accurate things below 100 hertz, so they're useful there too. That said, there are a few headphone brands that I recommend for this stuff. If you check out, I think our second to last live stream before this one, I think it's gotten like 40,000 views already. It's all about like, I try out all of the headphones that there are and give you my tasting notes on all of them. I don't know. Have you tried out this brand yet? These are Odyssey headphones. Have you tried this brand?
It looks like I tried them at NAMM.
Okay.
My thing is I do a lot of work down at 30 hertz when I mix. I know that probably sounds insane. Like I'm banging subs. I'm really into like new metal low end. And
the LCD 4s, I will say, will tell you useful things about 40 hertz.
Okay.
There's some of the best low end I've ever heard on headphones. 30, I don't know, might be a stretch even for them. They're probably rated at 30, but I would confidently make accurate decisions about them down into the 40 hertz range, which is extremely unusual for headphones. That would be the LCD 4 model for sure. The LCD 5s, maybe I'd be more confident around 45 hertz or something. But yeah, I hear what you're saying. If you want to really understand 30, which few mixers do, by the way, really understand what's happening at 30 in their mixes.
Gotta have a signature sound, man.
Yeah. That's part of it. All right. And then a question here. Would you still recommend your fast mixing with EQ in solo today, or would you recommend it in context, asks Dark Trap. So for those who don't know, Joel has this methodology called speed mixing, where he mixes really, really fast, and he wants to make decisions faster, which is great. And he's demonstrated this, EQing drums, just listening to them in solo, EQing them. And a lot of major mixers do say, don't EQ so much in solo. So what are your thoughts? Have your thoughts changed, or are there certain situations in which soloing does make sense or doesn't make sense? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I'll tell you this, ever since I switched to an SSL, I've been EQing a lot less, like probably 60% less, which is terrifying to me. But I will say this, I think that it's not an either or, and to do either or. I mean, sometimes you need to get in there on solo and really hear what the problem is, because you can't identify it in context. You need a more granular level of hearing. But at the same time, don't get me wrong, if I'm mixing fast and EQing in solo, I'm still have to go back to the big picture and get out of little picture land and look and zoom out, right? And look at what I'm doing and what I'm mixing. So I'm always EQing in context, even if I start in solo. So you got to do both. It's not either or. It's a combination of, it's a technique. There's no right or wrong. I mean, you can watch CLA mix in solo. He's incredible at it. You can watch him mix in context. He's incredible at that too. So is there a right? Is there a wrong way? If you know how to EQ, you know how to EQ.
Sure. Benj, one of your fellow analog lovers here in the chat, asks a question about software. He says, last minute question, does Joel ever use anything like Soothe or Rezo while going out of the box into an analog chain or on the way back in?
Sure. We actually invented before Soothe. We used to match cymbals to pink noise at Drum Forge, and we have a thing called DF Clarify that was like
Huh.
the first intelligent matching thing, and it came out before Soothe. But Soothe kind of took it, to a different thing. But they have different sonic signatures. I don't like plugins like that. I love what they do, and I think they're useful. Sometimes I use them, but again, when I bought a console, the distortion's inherent in a console. Like before I would open up cymbals and I would immediately throw something like DF Clarify or Soothe and just go EQ 30 things because they always sound like crap. It's the hardest thing to get right. Now, when I got an SSL, I don't need to do that a little bit of EQ because the distortion of the board takes out all those little resonances and stuff and just smooths it out and makes it sound amazing. I'll give you an example. I have an API 2500. I use it a lot for mastering. And a lot of times people come back and be like, what did you do to smooth out my mix? Like all that little harsh stuff I couldn't EQ out. Like it sounds amazing. What did you do? And I'm like, dude, just ran it through some gear, and like that particular compressor just has a way of removing harshness in the top end through distortion. I don't know how it does it, but it does. So
there are transformers and stuff that do this. We're producing right now a mixing masterclass with Sylvia Massey. And one of the things that she has in her chain, like on her mix bus, is like literally just a transformer. She's like, the signal goes into the transformer and out of the transformer.
Yes.
And
I have a pair.
It's like one that you can't find in any other piece of gear. And she's like swapped them out different times over the years.
I wonder if she got those from Rick Carson. My buddy Rick Carson, multi-Grammy nominated guy. He's like the biggest gear nerd I've ever met in my life. And he gave me these transformers from the original Focusrite Red compressors. He bought the whole stock of them. You can't find them. They don't exist on the internet. And there's only a couple other, like Reed Chippen's got them, Colin Britton's got them, I got a pair, Rick's got a pair, and like a couple other people. But I have them wired onto my back of my mix bus, and it's the sound of the Red 3 without the crappy compressor, as he put it.
So. Goodness. And one thing that I do have to ask, again, a little devil's advocate and push back here is one of the reasons you're EQing less is because at this stage in the game, you're getting better sounding tracks than you used to because of how you've grown in the interesting.
No, that's the same. I mean, even top level people in LA don't know how to engineer, I'll put it to you this way. I did a video on this in my YouTube. Engineering is a dying art right now. There are only a few engineers like Mike Plotnikoff, who works for Howard Benson and Hatch and Agaki. Like when you get tracks from those guys, you're like, wow, everyone else is like down here. It's like, they're that good. Like when you, oh my God. Yeah. I mean, I've mixed thousands and thousands of songs from home all the way to the best. Like the level of engineering is coming down right now. No one knows how to engineer anymore. And I see this more and more. And even the top guys, love them to death, they're not as good as people like Plotnikoff, who are true engineers, because they're writers, they're producers, they're editors, they're wearing 10 different hats. They don't just engineer. They don't just sit down and focus on mastering guitar tone or whatever. So no, the track level is actually getting worse. And if I didn't have Joe to save my ass, because he is like one of the best guitar guys, I think, in the planet, to reamp guitars and bass and stuff. And like, we have chains all on his side that we actually do a bunch of prep before it comes in. We're allowed to, that's the only way I can get better stuff is if we do it here. And sometimes, like I said, that's out of bounds and out of budget for artists. But, a lot of times we're in an epidemic where somebody home records their stuff and you're like, no, those guitars, like if you want to be competitive, no, you want us to do them, we'll get you there, and it's just like, you got to have that tough talk with the artist. So I see why you would say that though. And true, it does make more sense. Like when you mix Plotnikoff stuff, you don't need that much EQ, period. Because it already sounds so badass coming in. You're just like faders, have a nice day. But when you're doing everybody else's stuff, Mike Frazier's another god tier engineer, they're out there, but
yeah, it was funny. A great emblematic example of this is we had a guy doing a digital mix. It was Mick Gazowski at one of our mix cons, probably the second most popular mix con video. And he's doing a mix for Jamiroquai. And he sits down and says, hey, I'm Mick. Here's a track we have from Jamiroquai. Here's the kick drum. And the most common comment on the tens of thousands of comments on this video is, oh, I see why it sounds great. The tracks already sound great when he got them. And it's like, he's barely doing much at all to them. And people are like, well, I could have done that, is what the average person
I'm sure
feels.
They couldn't have.
Right. That's probably true. They probably would have tried to do too much, most of them, but they probably couldn't have, number one. But number two, it's like, yes, if you want your production to sound like that when it's finished, it should begin like that. Like you don't do everything wrong and then like fix it at the end. Like the great sounding mixes come from great sounding recordings, which come from great sounding arrangements and writing. And we all know this, and we all continually forget because we finally
That's a levels
sit down.
comment, Justin. right?
Yes.
Like that person's like a level 10, they're looking up at level 100 and they don't understand it yet. And they don't understand why level 100 to level 100. And like level 100 sitting there laughing at that comment because level 100 understands what it was like to be on level 10 and how naive and foolish they are. And I'm not trying to throw shade at the person making that comment in their best, intentions of saying something so silly, but they don't understand what the difference between high level mixing is and just EQing. Like there's so much more to what's going on in mix head other than just like what EQ he puts on. Again, that's a levels thing. That person doesn't get it yet. And it's hard to explain to them until they get to the point where they do understand it.
It's true. And it's also not even like the EQ thing are the things that the average person can really look at and recognize. And that's easy to demonstrate a before and after. One thing that's difficult to demonstrate a before and after on sometimes, and so few people actually do this. I've seen so few videos that do this, where it's like, here are the balance changes I made where I decided to emphasize this instrument relative to this one. And we're just using volume. Like listen to the volume choices before and after. Like there's no like bypass button on your fader or like all the fader changes you made. Like there would be ways to demonstrate it.
On that, Justin.
But say that again.
I did a whole course on that at URM in our enhanced program. We have something,
nice.
We have a fast track called Balance Trainer, which is like a
beautiful.
It's like a 2-week long thing just to talking about balance and training people to make better balancing decisions and empirically understand why and how things affect things.
So crucial. And it's like the most under-recognized part of mixing on YouTube is the mixing part of mixing. And this is why, again, we have this similar thing in Mixing Breakthroughs. We start off the course talking just about balance, like getting your mix basically there with balance and pan. And really, because it's that idea of like one of the reasons you're level 100 is like when you get to like there's that meme of like the different brain sizes, and then there's like the magical glowing brain at the end, right? And like the early stage of that, like, not listening for separation in the low end at all is like your earlier stage, and you're trying to make the kick and bass equally dominant in the same EQ area or whatever. And then the next stage is like, oh, I'm going to try to cut 80 hertz on one instrument and boost 80 hertz on the other. And that's how we get them to sit better together. And it's like, maybe that could work. And then there's like the next stage of like, arrange the kick and bass so they don't get in each other's way and work well together, and like sound selection and arrangement. And maybe the mind-blowing one at the end is like, actually on this song, matters. I don't need to hear both the kick and bass. And on this song, it's about the bass. And on that song, it's about the kick. And you don't have to hear everything equally loud at all times. The goal of mixing isn't to make everything equally audible at all times. It's to make the most important things that should resonate with people. And sometimes that means like Mind Explode, you actually don't need to hear both your kick and bass. You hear your bass and the kick as an afterthought on this track, and the track's better because of it, or vice versa. So yeah.
It's funny.
Those are things you don't think about until you're 10.
We recently had David Bendeth, and if you don't know David's diamond level producer, one of the greats. We had him on Nail the Mix, and just talking to David, I'm like, okay, David, they're going to want to know what EQ move you did. He's like, why? What's wrong with them? That doesn't matter. That's not important. I'm like, dude, you're level 100 explaining to level 10 that only understands and only cares about what EQ move you did. You gotta. So the thing is, none of that stuff matters. Like, it doesn't matter what processing mix, because again, you could say to me, hey, make this kick drum sound great. I can tell you 300 ways to do that. There's so many different techniques. It doesn't matter. What's more important is like a high level mixer is thinking about like, how do I pull the emotional impact out of the song? What is the right energy, the right movement, the right, you know what I mean? Like there's different levels, and you can't explain that to somebody who's on a lower level because they're not ready for that information and they won't understand it and what that means. Oh, I know that already. It's like, no, you don't. You don't understand it at all. I know because I teach this stuff.
I know. And to me, learning new stuff and trying to become a beginner again, I've become a beginner at chess, and recognizing that idea of there's some people who are like grandmasters who are talking to me about what they're doing. And I'm like, nope, not even ready. Can't learn from you yet. I got to go over here. I got to get out of kindergarten 100%. First. We'll come back to you in several years, and that is okay. That's what happens. One of the tricky things though, is sometimes the people who know the most on a format like YouTube, you could get the least views and the least exposure relative. Like there are people out there right now who are getting way more views per video than Joel is on his YouTube videos, who are giving you information that is way less priceless than what Joel would give you. But it's more accessible because more people are in that playground, and they're not necessarily at a level where what you're talking about right now, Joel, is going to help them. Because the answer of getting a console is not the answer for 99% of people listening to this.
No one wants to hear that.
I just want to add that like, first of all, you getting a console right now, even if everything Joel said was true, and some people will debate whether or not it's true or whether or not it even makes sense, and that's fine. And I can a different day we'll have those people on this podcast, and there are things that I'm going to agree with those people about, just like there are things I agreed with you about. But that advice, like what I would say to the average person who got this far and they're nowhere near that stage, is that as much as Joel is obsessing about the gear, I would just couch that in, don't let lack of gear stop you from working on the things that are more important than gear. And there's a good chance, Joel, that you might not have benefited from the console in the same way that you are now if you had gotten one 15 or 20 years ago. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, I wasn't ready.
Something good about building up your chops in the way that you did. And maybe that being part of your journey is a useful thing that helped you understand audio in a way that you might not otherwise. So
I wasn't ready for it for sure. Again, there's different levels and stages in your career where different things make sense. It makes sense for me to own a console because I get high budget artists that can afford to pay me full mix rate. And, I can afford to have a console, but like if this was 2012 or, 2008, I'd be sitting there in like my basement making $300 a day. And I would be fantasizing about owning a console. And I would be like, I just saved up for 3 months and I can buy my, a preamp, you know what I mean? So I get it. Like, different stages, you need different things. 100%.
Yeah. One person is in here, Dark Trap Studios, asking, Justin, do you think it could be a good thing for my level getting a console? And I've heard Dark Trap stuff and it sounds great. One difference I know between you, Dark Trap, and how really good your stuff sounds already, and Joel, is that I know Joel is billing in a way that it makes sense to have the console. Here's the thing I would not recommend around consoles. Here's the last thing I'll say on this subject from my perspective, is that I do not believe that studios operate on a, if you build it, they will come basis. I do not think that is true at all, because I've seen so many rich people who were, handed down an inheritance or something. They build a studio, they have the studio for 5 years to 8 years. The lease runs up, the thing goes tits up, and they're like, we never had any clients. This was a total waste. It was an albatross around my neck. We never did anything with it. There are so many studios that have so much nice gear that I've been in that are now Paneras or, a Starbucks or something else. And they, my friend Joel Hamilton, another Joel, once said to me something along the lines of one of the most depressing things you ever see. Say it again.
I think I just bought, isn't he a Milwaukee guy? I think I just bought his ADR compressor.
Sounds like something he might sell. He lived in the Midwest ages ago. I think he was originally from Cape Cod, lived in the Midwest.
I just bought his ADR compressor.
But he's 100%. Been in Brooklyn for many years now, so it might be a different Joel. But anyway, one of his quotes is, he'll be on MixCon soon too. One of his quotes is, there's nothing more depressing than being in an empty studio that looks like it's just waiting for Mariah Carey to walk in at any moment, and she never does. So that's my thing is, yeah, if you're producing, you're looking to get clients, like the console, I don't think is a thing that's going to get you the clients if you don't have any traction already. You, Joel, you already have the traction, you have the clients, and you can do a mathematical equation that is, it will add X number of dollars to my overhead per month if I get a console. I can justify that because I, on average right now, earn X dollars a month, and I can reasonably, if I bust my butt, get to Y dollars per month. Like, for me, Joel Hamilton is another Joel who I love, who mixes on a console and has surrounded by gorgeous analog gear. Check out Studio G Brooklyn. You'd get along with Joel in some of these respects as other Joel. All of the analog gear he has around him are the trappings of success. They are not necessarily what made him successful, because I knew him when he was starting like on ADATs and a Mackie, and then he graduated to, they got this, Neve broadcast console, and they started getting their gate stay levels and getting their first analog gear. And then they got their first U47. But each one of those pieces of gear that they got and added to the studio was because of a project they had done that they then reinvested into their studio. And it continued to be built and built over time. So when you see him with a giant rack of stuff behind him, it's not like he plunked down $1 million all at once and was like, let me buy $1 million of gear and hope it turns out. It's like, no, it was amassed over 20 to 30 years, one piece at a time, off of the profits of each project, or the prospects of, probably in some cases, the prospects of future projects that they could reliably anticipate based on work they had done in the past. So that's the thing, is that you're plugging this into income that already exists around this. And I think that's important.
I got a good story for you. You'll like this. Okay. So I have an intern in the building. Okay. He's not an intern anymore, but he'll forever be the intern. He's not even our intern. He's the guy across the hall. Okay. So, he came to me and Joe, maybe like 2 years ago, and he was like, I want to up my level. And he was like, do I want to start recording local rappers at 20, 1 hour at a time? It's a waste of time. And I'm like, no, absolutely. And he's like, why? Everybody online says, I'm like, no, ignore those people. They haven't made money in this business. I have, and I bet I've stuck around. So let me give you some old man advice. So I told him, so he started taking all this rap. He started, getting a good clientele. And 2 years ago, he came to us. He's like, I want to up my quality and stuff. And, the other guy in the building's arguing, telling him, it's not about gear, it's about passion, this and that. So he came to us and we started helping him invest in his stuff. And he's probably dropped like 70K in equipment now that he's paid for. And, he bought my old console. He's got a C800G and a Tube Tech, and it's 251. And like, he has got you can't go to a studio in the world and get a better setup. In the meantime, he's up in an attic in a super little room. But man, because he's been working hard and because he had established clients and he kept upping his quality level, dude is the biggest hip hop guy in the city right now. And nobody is even close. No one goes to anybody else because they can't match his quality. They can't match his gear. They can't they can't match his rate. And, it was the right time. So at a certain point, it makes sense because the gear is a force multiplier. Like if you're a hustler, you're going to be a hustler. You're going to make money. You're going to be successful, period. No matter what you work on, what environment that you're going to be in. You're a hustler. I'm a hustler. It doesn't matter what we do. We're going to win at it, period. That's just that's how our brains are wired. But you take something that can improve your quality. Now that becomes a weapon. So for example, when he got, his first real microphone, and went up from like an 87 to a 251 immediately, all of his rappers were like, oh my God. And then they were like, dude, who recorded your stuff? And like, he just blew up overnight around town. He was already doing good, but he could already afford the gear. But it totally in the last, 2 years has changed his life. His rate is a lot higher right now. He is the guy and no one around town is even close to him and isn't going to catch up for a long time. So, I'm just saying it can go both ways. Like you got to start out with like you're saying, right? The boots on the ground, it's skills, it's hustle, it's hard work. There's no excuse not to start. When I started in a basement with an interface, you know what I mean? And just made it work. Right. But at some point, you get more serious and the projects pay for equipment and it makes sense to invest to a certain degree, depending on what you're doing in yourself. You don't need an SSL if you're not a mixer. But you could go buy an API box console for $16,000 and track drums and get insanely high quality level tracks and stuff like that and do mixing through it and, be a very versatile producer. One of the best producers in Nashville right now, a guy named Andrew Bayless, who's a writer who's just killing it. He's done guys like Jelly Roll. Bayless has got a box too. And man, every time he sends me his tracks, they just sound awesome, man. Like they just mix so incredible. And I've watched him have a titanic rise from doing nothing to now being one of the A-call guys and just writing hit after hit after hit. So, like you need at some point, if you want, it's hard to set the expectation that you're going to go and you're going to compete against A-list people and stay in the game with a laptop and, in most genres, in some genres like EDM, it's fine because you're not really recording anything.
Some people are doing it. I have to say, yeah. I have to only give the counterfactual. There's Glenn Schick, who I recently interviewed. He uses the LCD4s. They're $4,000 or $5,000 pair of headphones. Granted, they're very expensive headphones, but he does mix on nothing but on nothing but plugins and headphones. And he's doing Justin Bieber and, J. Cole.
Do exist. 100%.
And, so there is that. Now, granted, he is not mastering on a pair of $400 headphones. So there is that. He's mastering on a $4,000 pair of headphones.
20 years,
what was
30
that?
years? How long has he been?
Yes, he's been at a long
years?
time, probably since at least the 90s. Yeah, he's
right.
Massive
He's
credits.
not somebody sitting in their bedroom with 2 years of experience. So,
This
what
is
I mean?
correct.
Like there is experience, equipment, it's not either or, there's a time and place for everything, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, if you had to choose one, it's got to be the experience, but why choose if you don't have to is the other thing.
Sure. I like mixing
Joel.
analog as well.
It was wonderful having you. Thank you for giving your take to both the haters and the lovers. I'm sure we'll have some of both. It was awesome to have you here. Really loved how confident you are about, when you believe something, you're all in on it and you don't go all in until you really believe. And I can tell that you do. So I'm excited for you and your setup. I'm excited that you really feel like you're doing the best work that you have. And I'm looking forward to hearing more of it come out.
Thank you, Justin. I appreciate it. And thank you everybody for watching this.
All right. Thanks for hanging out with us. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop with Joel Wanasek. See you next time.